Chapter 19 of the Terriford Mystery by Marie Belloc Lowndes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. As she walked away from the great advocate's chambers, Jean Bower felt happier than she had felt since the terrible morning when Harry Garlett had been arrested in her presence on the charge of murder. Though she felt certain that her forthcoming interview with Garlett would not bring the result Sir Harold evidently expected it to do, yet, deep in her heart, she was full of joy at the thought of seeing the man she loved. Her heart had hungered for him, and nothing but the knowledge that he shrank from seeing her in the shameful place where he was now strictly confined had prevented her making an effort to see him. It was an infinite comfort to feel that it was now her duty to do so. She had deliberately sent no word of her approaching return to Bonny Doon, and when she went out of Grendon Station, where she had always been met by either her uncle or her aunt, even by Elsie if neither of them could come, there swept over her a curious feeling that henceforth she must live her life alone, if only because of her promise to the man on whose instructions she was now acting. Quickly she walked away from the station, intent on seeing Mr. Toogood, so that her interview with Harry Garlett should be arranged as soon as possible. But when she turned into the high street of the busy country town, she became aware that she had been recognized by certain of the people who had passed her, and by the time she had reached the lawyer's office, some 10 to 20 men and women were dogging her footsteps. She began to feel like a hunted thing, and oh, the relief of finding herself in the hall of the house where she had come with her uncle on the day her lover had been arrested. This time Jean was shown straight into the room where Mr. Toogood, the last time she was here, had remained closeted with her uncle for so long. She went, as was her nature, straight to the point. "I have made up my mind to ask for an order to see Mr. Garlett," she said quietly, "and I should be grateful if you would tell him, Mr. Toogood, that it is because I have to speak to him on a matter of importance that I'm doing what I know he does not wish me to do."
"I've always thought his attitude as to that quite unreasonable," said the lawyer in a decided tone.
"How would you like Mrs. Toogood or your daughter to see you in prison?" asked Jean in a low voice.
"There's something in that, especially as I suppose you realize, Miss Bower, that you won't see Mr. Garlett alone."
"I thought, perhaps, that as I want to see him on private business, I would be granted the privilege of seeing him alone." He shook his head.
"There is no country in the world, Miss Bower, where such privileges are extended to a prisoner under remand. I, as Mr. Garlett's legal adviser, have free private access to him. But you cannot expect the same privilege. Whatever you have to say to him will be said in the presence of 2 warders."
He saw that this was a great surprise to her, and she looked deeply troubled.
"I'll tell you what I'll do," he exclaimed. "I'll put the case to the governor. I suppose you've met him?"
"I remember that he was in the cricket pavilion at that big match last May, and I even had a talk with him, but I don't suppose he'll remember me."
"You do yourself an injustice," exclaimed the old lawyer gallantly. "I expect Colonel Brackbury remembers you very well indeed. In any case, I will put the matter to him personally. I take it, Miss Bower," he looked at her hard, "that you really require to see Mr. Garlett on business?"
"I would willingly tell you why I wish to see him, but I have given my word to tell no one." She hesitated, and then, "I have been asked to put a certain question to him."
"Kentworthy making the poor girl do his dirty work," thought Mr. Toogood.
Aloud, he observed,
"Well, my dear young lady, I'll see what can be done. I know the governor will stretch a point if he can. He is on very cordial terms with your uncle, and I seem to remember that he's a regular cricket maniac. Funny, isn't it, that such things should make any difference? But they do. I've found out that the lawyer who doesn't allow for the oddities of human nature makes a great mistake. I mean professionally. I hope you've left everyone quite well at home, eh? I mean at Bonny Doon."
"I've been in London," she answered, "so I haven't seen them since the day before yesterday."
"That fixes it," said the lawyer to himself. "I wonder what Kentworthy wants that poor girl to get out of Garlett. Surely he's never told her to find out who was in the wood with him. That would be hard on her. Yet he may be beginning to see what I've always seen, that Garlett's one hope is to bring some other woman into the case."
They both got up. He strolled across to his window and saw with dismay that a crowd had gathered below on the broad pavement, waiting for the heroine of the Terriford Mystery to appear.
Haven't you got a car? He asked, surprised.
I thought of walking home.
No need to do that, he said kindly. I'll telephone and ask my daughter to bring our car along. She'll get you to Bonny Doon in no time. Meanwhile, will you go into the other room for a minute? I have a private message to give her.
Slightly surprised, Jean did as he asked her. Then, when he had got through to his house, he said,
Is that you, Kitty?
Yes, Father.
I want you to run the car along here. Are you listening?
Listening hard, Father.
Good. Now don't come through the high street. You've got to make your way somehow into Juniper Alley, to the back of this house. There's a crowd gathered at the front door waiting for that poor child, Jean Bower, to come out. I want to get her away without anyone seeing her. You'll only have to drive her to Bonny Doon. It won't take you long.
Then he brought his young visitor back to his room.
Now look here, my dear. We've got about 10 minutes before my daughter can be here, and I haven't had an opportunity of seeing you alone since we met. You remember when? I want to tell you to be of good heart. It's a tremendously important point on your side. I wonder if you realize how important, that no arsenic has been traced to Harry Garlett's possession. What's more, poor Mrs. Garlett was poisoned with white arsenic. We've got one of the biggest poison experts in the world ready to go into the box and swear that Mrs. Garlett was poisoned with pure arsenic, not arsenic extracted from some article in common use.
She looked at him gratefully, but remained silent.
Then there's another point, he went on. A great deal has been made of those strawberries which were eaten by Mrs. Garlett on the fatal evening. As a matter of fact, no one saw her eat them, and no one has the slightest idea who brought them into her room. It's very unfortunate that your uncle conveyed the impression, as he certainly did, that he knew as a fact that Mrs. Garlett received those strawberries from her husband's hand. He knew nothing of the kind.
I've never been able to understand the question of the strawberries and why so much importance has been attached to them, said Jean Bower in a low voice.
Importance has been attached to them, said the lawyer decidedly, because they seem to have been the only vehicle by which the poison could have been administered. The prosecution have 2 witnesses ready to swear that they saw the small dish of strawberries sprinkled thickly with powdered sugar outside Mrs. Garlett's door at 5 o'clock, and that at 7 o'clock the dish was no longer there.
How strange, said Jean in an oppressed tone.
Mr. Garlett denies having even seen the strawberries. The lawyer who took Miss Cheel's evidence on commission received from her the assurance that she did not know who had given Mrs. Garlett the fruit. She simply assumed that it must have been Mr. Garlett. Sir Harold Anstey, you will remember I told you about him last time you were in this room, will certainly make the most of the fact that no one knows what happened to those strawberries. Not only the fruit, but the dish, one of a set of 4, disappeared from the top of the chest of drawers where it was known to have been that afternoon. The apparent obliteration of the dish is a very curious circumstance.
I suppose it is, said Jean doubtfully.
That odd occurrence, coupled with the fact that no purchase of arsenic has been traced to our friend, will certainly be an important point in his favor, so you must keep up heart.
I try to, said Jean. I'm feeling happier. She stopped short. She had nearly said, now that I have seen Sir Harold Anstey. Mr. Toogood looked at his watch.
Kitty will be waiting for you now.
He opened the door and then, to her surprise, said a little hurriedly,
No, not downstairs, but upstairs, Miss Bower. My daughter prefers driving up to the back of the house.
As he uttered these lying words, he was leading her up the staircase, she bewildered but obedient. When they reached the top story, he led her down a passage, and then they walked silently down what had been the back stairs of the old mansion when it was a dwelling house. Once on the ground floor, he took her rapidly through a small paved court into a kind of little alley where the car stood waiting.
Goodbye, Miss Jean. I'll see if I can catch the governor today, and then your interview will take place, if it can be managed, tomorrow morning.
It was not often that Mr. Toogood felt a pang of curiosity. As a rule, lawyers know too much, not too little, of their clients' affairs. But he did wonder very much what it was that Kentworthy had asked Jean Bower to find out. He felt sure that she would fail in her task. Harry Garlett was the last man to be persuaded to say anything he did not wish to say, and if he had indeed been holding clandestine meetings in the wood with some woman whose name he alone knew, he would certainly not give the lady away. Mr. Toogood chuckled a little as he found his way back to his room, remembering that his good friend, Colonel Brackbury, governor of His Majesty's prison at Grendon, had said to him only 2 days before, I feel interested in Jean Bower. I thought her a most attractive girl.
We had quite a talk at that cricket match last spring. I should very much like to see her again."
Late that same afternoon, Elsie put her head through the door of the dining room of Bonny Doon. "You're wanted on the telephone, Miss Jean." "Would you rather I went, my dear?" asked her aunt kindly. "I'll go," said the girl quickly. "I think I know who it is." And sure enough, it was Mr. Toogood.
"It's all right, Miss Bower. If you will be at the prison 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, the governor will himself be present at your interview with Mr. Garlett. He says he will keep out of earshot. I hope you are pleased."
"I am indeed," she called back, "and very grateful to you." And then she walked back slowly to the room where her uncle and aunt were sitting. She was sorry now that she had not confided to them her intention of seeing Harry Garlett, but she had shrunk from doing so, for she knew they were hurt with her for concealing the reason of her visit to London. As she opened the door, she said abruptly, "I am going to see Harry tomorrow morning. I called at Mr. Toogood's office on my way home and arranged it." As neither of them spoke, she went on, catching her breath a little. "Try not to mind my not being able to tell you why I want to see him. I've promised not to do so, but it is important. It may make a difference at the trial." There was a pause, and then Mrs. McLean said, a little coldly, "Neither your uncle nor I wish to interfere in your private affairs, my dear. You are grown up, and you have a right to do as you please. But your uncle has a very wide knowledge of life, and I think you would probably find that, in the long run, it would be worth your while to take him into your confidence." Jean burst into bitter sobs, and her aunt got up from her chair and put her arms around her. "Come, come, don't be offended, childie. It's only that we're so anxious, that's all. The matter's so terribly important. Not only to you, but to your uncle. Perhaps you don't quite realize that, eh?" "How do you mean?" exclaimed Jean, glancing from one to the other.
"Well," said Dr. McLean slowly, "I've not said anything about it, for I've known that your trouble, my dear, has been much, much greater than mine. But of course this terrible affair is a fearful blow to my professional reputation, and though for a little while people will be eager to see me, after I've been badgered and worried like a rat, worried by a terrier in the witness box, the better class of my patients are sure to say, 'Better not send for old McLean. Do you remember that stupid mistake he made over the death certificate of that patient of his who was poisoned?'"
"I didn't realize all that. Oh, how sorry I am that I've brought all this awful trouble on you," exclaimed Jean, looking from the one to the other of them with unhappy, haunted eyes. For the first time since this great trouble had come on them all, they separated that evening, not on their usual affectionate, open terms, the one with the other, and it was after a night spent wide awake in bitter self-communing that Jean got up early the next morning. "I'll breakfast with you in the kitchen," she said to Elsie. "I've got to be at the prison by 10 o'clock, and I should like to get out of the house before my uncle and aunt come downstairs." The modern prison of Grendon was built at a time in the 19th century when there was still but small reverence for historic buildings. Within the vast enclosure surrounded by walls 5 feet thick, still stands the mound crowned by the ruins of a Norman keep, known to antiquaries as Grendon Castle. And close to that high mound rises the medieval mass of brick and stone, locally called the Old Prison. To the imaginative historian, that house of woe, long emptied though it be of suffering humanity, is of far greater interest than are the remains of the castle. Last, but from the point of view of the townspeople by far the most important, within the same vast enceinte, is the 18th century pillared building where the county assizes are always held, and where many a famous trial has taken place. But the public doors to the assize court are reached from without the great walls, some way from the jealously guarded entrance to the modern prison, and to the vast space in which it stands. Till comparatively lately, the public were freely admitted to what is still called the Castle Yard, and public meetings of deep import to the state were held there. But now it is difficult to obtain even permission to visit the castle ruins and the old prison. Jean Bower had walked quickly through the keen morning air, and so, being full half an hour early, she paced up and down for what seemed a long time under the stout walls. At last, when her watch told her it was 9:45, she rang the bell of the small postern door cut into the great gate. There came the sound of footsteps on stone flags, the clanking of big keys, and then the door was opened by a gray-haired man in uniform. Taking the admission order from her hand, he glanced over it and looked at her with quickened interest. "You're a bit early, if I may say so," he said kindly, "but you follow me, miss, and I'll see what I can do." As she walked under the vaulted gateway past the quaint little opening which evidently led into her guide's home, Jean found herself on the edge of a vast paved enclosure. To her left rose the huge mound, and in front of the mound, as if cut out of the paving stones, was a round lawn of closely cropped turf. Then, gradually, she became aware that behind a row of tall, now leafless plane trees, was a strange-looking building of dark red brick and gray stone. There was something stark and desolate about the irregular outline, which showed sharply clear against the pale blue of the winter sky. Her companion followed the direction of her eyes. "Aye, that's the old prison," he observed. "Folk used to come from a long way to go over that place, but now it isn't shown, ever. But as you've got a few minutes to spare, miss, maybe you'd like to have a look at it." He took her assent for granted, and slowly they began walking straight toward what Jean now knew to be a very famous place, famous if only because it had been the first prison visited by Elizabeth Fry. "Where is the real prison?" she asked hesitatingly. "You turn yourself right around about, and you'll see it clear enough." She turned quickly, and beyond the castle mound, far to the right, she saw a large, commonplace-looking yellow brick building which reminded her of a modern factory. The knowledge that Harry Garlett was there gave her a stab of pain. Quickly she turned away and once more stared at the sinister-looking old prison, and it was with a thrill of surprise that she saw that the low doors giving access to the dark, grimy-looking building were all wide open. "I should be afraid to come here at night," she exclaimed. "That place looks as if it were haunted." "You're not the only one to say that. My wife wouldn't go in the old prison, not after dark, for £100. It's said that on All Hallows Eve one hears groans and awful moanings a-going on the whole night. However, I've never been there to see, and bless you, people are sure to say them sort of things about that sort of place. Now you come along, and I'll show you what many a lady in Grendon would give a good bit to see." He moved on, his bunch of keys clanging in his big hands as he walked, till they came right up to the widest of the low entrances to the deserted building. The black oak iron-bound door had been champed back to the wall, leaving the way in clear. "I'd best go in first," said the porter, and Jean, following him, found herself almost at once in pitch darkness, groping along a narrow passage. Suddenly he took out of his pocket and turned on an electric torch, but that only seemed to make more dense the thick-feeling blackness, though it enabled Jean to see what on each side of the passage were tiny, windowless cells. Was it possible that human beings had ever been confined in such holes as that? They walked on and on along the lightless, airless burrows, and once the girl stumbled badly on the uneven earthen floor. At last the porter stayed his steps and held up his hand. She saw it gleaming redly against the bright white light cast by his torch. "This is the place folk most wants to come and gloat over," he observed in a half-joking tone. They were on the threshold of a low vaulted chamber, and a moment later he and Jean were standing in the middle of the otherwise empty, windowless, crypt-like room, by what looked like an enormous kitchen table, excepting that it was made of stone. Jean's guide threw the light of his torch right onto the gray, stained surface, and she saw that into the stone 2 deep ruts had been cut, one each way. "Folk were drawn and quartered on this 'ere table," he explained, "and not so very long ago, missy. The last lot done here was a batch of what they called the rebels, the Scotchies, who reckoned they wanted another king. Just before my time they used to keep here, careless-like on the table, the big knife and fork with which they quartered the poor wretches. But now they're put away in what's called Grendon Museum." As if talking to himself, he went on musingly. "Hanging's a sight more merciful than the old ways they had of doing men and women to death. That I always will maintain. But a hanging's a gruesome sight. Maybe we'll have time for me to take you just round to see the gallows. Leastways, you won't see much. Only a kind of platform, you know. That's where they're turned off. It's just off the new prison." And then the good man felt considerably startled, for the girl he had supposed to be at his side, staring down at the stone table, had disappeared. He flashed his torchlight round the stone walls, and with relief perceived that she was leaning up against the side of the arched entrance which gave into the black passageway. Her face was drawn and very pale, and all at once he remembered her relation with the man who, it was confidently expected by most of the people connected with Grandin Prison, would be the next poor wretch to be turned off.
"Bless my soul!" he exclaimed. "I oughtn't to have said that. I clean forgot about your friend, missy. What a fool I am, to be sure."
There was a tone of deep dismay and regret in the voice in which he uttered these words. "I'm all right now," Jean said faintly. "I suddenly felt queer. I think the air must be very bad in this place."
"Of course it is," he agreed. "No draught through."
And then he went on, this time in a very serious voice.
"As I've said so much, miss, I'll say just one more thing to ye."
"Yes?" she said questioningly, standing away from the door. She had no idea what he was going to say, and yet somehow she felt horribly afraid.
"Hanging, as now practised," he observed, "is a very merciful form of death. It isn't hanging at all, so to speak. They just breaks the poor chap's neck, and it's all over in a second. He don't know it's happening till it has happened, if you take my meaning."
She took his meaning only too well, and with a wild wish to escape from her now torturing thoughts, she turned out of that awful room of death and almost ran along the cavernous way and so out into the fresh air. Her guide followed, uncertain whether he had been right or wrong in saying what he had last said to her.
"But there," he said to himself, "the poor little missy may be glad to remember it some March morning."
But when he saw her face in the daylight, he exclaimed,
"Dang me, the wife's right. I do talk too much, that I do."
And then shamefacedly he added,
"Best say nothing of my having shown you a bit of the old prison, eh? I mean, to the governor."
"Of course I won't," she murmured. Soon they reached the great gate, and then the man took hold of Jean Bower's arm.
"Mary Ann!" he called out.
A tall, thin woman came out.
"Yes?"
she said acidly.
"What do you want, John?" "Give this young lady a drop of that brandy I've got in the cupboard. Give it to her neat, no water, Mary Ann. That old prison of ours has turned her over queer."
The woman gave a quick look at Jean, and then she ran indoors. A moment later she came back, a small glass in her hand. Hardly knowing what she was doing, the girl gulped down the brandy. Almost at once she felt better, and the color came back into her face. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of the Terriford Mystery by Marie Belloc Lowndes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Jean Bower sat in the waiting room of what was called the new prison. Though she was clad in a warm fur cloak, which had just been given her by her uncle and aunt, she felt dreadfully cold. She was miserably anxious and uneasy as to her coming interview with Harry Garlett. How could she ask the man she loved so degrading a question? How make him understand the great importance all those concerned with his defense attached to what she took to be a lying bit of low gossip? The door of the waiting room opened, and Colonel Brackbury walked in.
"Miss Bower, I had the pleasure of meeting you early last May."
And then he shook hands with her warmly. But although he was touched at his visitor's look of deep sadness and at the pallor of her young face, he hardened himself to say that which he knew must be said.
"I have stretched a great point in assenting to your wish for what practically amounts to a private interview with Henry Garlett. I must ask you to give me your solemn word of honor that you will not hand him or try to convey to him anything surreptitiously. Also, that you will not make the slightest attempt to approach him."
"To approach him?" echoed Jean uncertainly.
"There will be a table between Mr. Garlett and yourself. You must not stretch across it and try to shake hands with him, for instance."
"I quite understand, and I promise to do what you ask."
"Some time ago a lady was allowed to see her husband, who, like Mr. Garlett, was as yet untried. Although a warder was present at the interview, she managed, unseen by the warder, to roll along the floor toward her husband a small ball containing a dose of prussic acid."
He looked at her significantly, but Jean made no comment. It was to her as if she were living through some awful nightmare.
"I understand that you desire to see Henry Garlett with reference to some matter concerning his defense."
She answered in a strangled tone, "But for that I should not have asked to see him."
"I should like you to know," he said kindly, "that we are doing everything we can to make Mr. Garlett comfortable. In our country, a man is accounted absolutely innocent until he is adjudged guilty. Apart from the irksomeness of the confinement, and the not being able to see his friends freely, Mr. Garlett is leading much the same life as he would lead outside, were he, what of course he is not, a recluse. I am taking special pains to see that he has good and nourishing food." And then, rather to his surprise, for he really knew very little about human nature, Jean Bower began to cry. "Come, come," he said, dismayed. "This won't do. You must do your best to hearten him up, you know."
"I will," she whispered. "I will, indeed." And then she added a pathetic word. "I didn't think you would be so kind."
"I'm not kind," he exclaimed testily. "I'm only doing my duty. There, that's right."
For she was trying to smile. And then they started walking down what seemed to the girl interminable cold, clean, bare passages. But at last they passed through a baize door into what had once been the governor's official residence before the pleasant villa which the Brackburys occupied had been built, and where were now situated the prison offices. The governor opened the door of a large room and courteously stood aside to allow her to pass in, and then suddenly Jean, through a mist of blinding tears, saw Harry Garlett. He was standing close to the wall behind a long, narrow table to her left. For a moment she thought him unchanged, and then she saw that all the healthy, outdoor man look had gone, and that there was an awful air of strain in the eyes, which seemed the only thing alive in his pale, set face. A fire was burning at the other end of the room, but it was very cold, and the atmosphere was full of the musty feeling of an uninhabited room. Colonel Brackbury brought over a chair for Jean to sit upon. Then looking from the girl to his prisoner, he said, "And now I will leave you to your talk, Miss Bower. You see that door over there? I shall be close to it, reading my paper, and I shall not be able to hear anything you say unless you raise your voices." He walked quickly down the long room, and Jean sat down on the chair he had provided for her. For a few moments neither of them said anything. She sat with downcast eyes, trying to repress the tears which would come in spite of her effort to keep them back, while he, poor wretch, gazed at her, all his soul in his sunken eyes, remembering. At last she whispered, "You don't mind my having come? There is a real reason, Harry, or I would not have done it."
"It was only because I didn't feel I could bear the thought of your coming to such a place that I wrote as I did," he answered in a low voice. "But oh, how glad I am to see you now." Sinking his voice yet further, he whispered, "My darling, darling love." She felt as if the sobs she must repress would strangle her utterance, but at last she managed to say, "I have come to ask you to tell me something." She stopped, not knowing how to word her stupid, her unnecessary, her insulting question. "Yes?" he said eagerly. "Ask me anything in the world, Jean." And then as she at last looked up and he saw the lines that pain and acute suspense had written on her face, he gave a low groan. "Oh, my God!" he exclaimed. "I can't bear your looking like this, Jean. Mrs. McLean told me you were quite well." She said quietly, "I am quite well, but I lay awake last night thinking of today. I'm so afraid." She waited and then began again. "I'm so dreadfully afraid that you'll be angry, that you won't understand. But the question I've come to ask you is supposed to be so important. And yet, oh, Harry," he broke in. "What is it? Come, Jean, you've nothing to be afraid of. You could never make me angry. Surely you know that. Whatever you ask me, I'll answer truthfully." "The other side have a witness," she murmured in a low, strained voice, "who will swear that she saw you at night in the wood which joins part of your garden with a young woman." Instead of the quick, contemptuous denial she had felt so absolutely certain would come, Harry Garlett remained silent for what seemed a long time. Then he asked, "Who is the witness?" "Lucy Warren." His face had turned a dull red, and as if not knowing what he was doing, his hands began nervously drumming on the table before him. "Lucy Warren says the person you were with was a stranger to her,
added Jean slowly, and she saw a look of intense relief flash over his worn face.
Well, my dear, he said gently, what is it you wish to ask me?
I want to know, she said in a trembling voice, whether what she says is true. Before he spoke, she knew from the look on his face what his answer, if he spoke the truth, must be, and her heart was contracted for the first time in her life with a passion of anguished jealousy. She looked at him fixedly, and something of what she was feeling showed in her set face and wide-open eyes. At last he said slowly, as if the words were indeed being dragged out of him.
Yes, it is quite true that I was there twice at night and with a woman. But the fact has nothing remotely to do with my forthcoming trial for murder. So you must not ask me who the woman was, Jean. It would be most unfair to drag her into this terrible business of mine. I am sure you will understand that?
He was looking at her straightly, but speaking with obvious embarrassment and unease.
Of course, I was a fool to do a thing so likely to cause poisonous gossip, he went on. But you will believe me when I tell you, before God, that it was not my fault. There are certain things concerning his past life that no man has the right to reveal, even to his nearest and dearest.
Then, more confidently, he exclaimed,
Jean, you do understand, you do agree that it would be a shame to bring someone who has nothing to do with the matter at all into such a case as mine will be?
Of course I agree to that, she whispered. And yet, Harry, and yet... She looked at him so imploringly that for the first time he leaned forward in his eagerness across the table which separated them, and there came a warning cough from the distant, half-open door. He straightened himself quickly, and over his face she saw flash a painful look of impotent anger. She said desperately, You really feel you ought not to tell who was with you that night in the wood, not even to me?
Not even to you. I am not a quixotic fool, my darling. If I thought it would make the slightest difference, of course, I would obtain permission from the person in question to reveal her identity. But it would make no difference. It would simply... He stopped, then choosing his words carefully, he concluded, draw a hateful, vulgar red herring across the path. I'm afraid that is the object of the people who want me to give you the name of this lady who was with me in the wood.
As she made no answer to that, he looked at her searchingly.
I have a right to ask you to believe that I did nothing of which I am now ashamed.
And then there fell on them a long, long silence. Jean felt overcome, dazed with miserable suspicions. It was as if this man whom she still loved with so absorbing a passion had suddenly revealed himself as being quite other than what she had thought him. Again there came the sound of a little cough, followed by the rustling of a newspaper being slowly folded up. Jean did not look round, but she could hear Colonel Brackbury coming toward them.
Miss Bower, I'm afraid your time is up.
He looked at his prisoner.
Come round to the end of the table, Garlett. I know Miss Bower would like to shake hands with you.
He turned away deliberately, and then Harry Garlett took the poor girl in his arms.
I swear to you, he whispered brokenly, that you have been my only love.
She raised her face, her lips to his. I do know that. God bless you, my own darling. And then quickly they fell apart, for with a warning, the governor, without turning round, exclaimed, Come along, Miss Bower. Jean Bower walked away from the prison gate in a maze of such misery as she had not believed a human being could feel. For the first time in her life she realized what some people learn very soon, and others never learn at all, even if they live to be quite old people. This is that we do not know, with any real knowledge, even those whom we most passionately love and trust. She had felt so sure, so absolutely certain that the story of Harry Garlett's meeting a woman in the wood was a malicious lie, and now she knew that it was true, and that there was some strange, painful mystery behind it. She had seen his pale face flush, and the look of embarrassment, almost of shame, with which he had muttered, There are certain things about his past no man has the right to reveal, even to his nearest and dearest. Her mind hastily surveyed the young women known to her who lived in and about Grendon. There were at least a dozen with whom Harry Garlett was on easy terms of acquaintanceship, but no young people had ever come openly to the thatched house. Mrs. Garlett did not care for girls, and Agatha Cheel was well known to have no friends, with the exception of Miss Prince. She walked on, threading her way as if blindly through mean and shabby streets, and as she looked furtively to the right and left, she knew that in every one of those little houses there were people who were honestly convinced that Harry Garlett had poisoned his wife for love of her. Small wonder that she hurried on till at last she was in the open country, with not a creature in sight. There, standing on a field path, she stopped and burst into bitter tears. Crying did her good. It seemed to lift something of the load weighing on her despondent heart. She dried her eyes, vaguely telling herself that she would walk on till she felt too tired to go on. Then, turning back, she would in time reach Terriford village. She had been walking for close on an hour, her nerves sensibly soothed by the fresh air, when all at once she saw in front of her a farmhouse which she knew to be the home of Lucy Warren. The sight of this place reminded her that her next painful task must be to see Lucy Warren, to try to persuade the girl to tell her that thing which it was so vital she should know, and which yet she knew Harry Garlett hoped she would never know. There are people, perhaps more women than men, who delight in discovering that which those about them do not wish them to know. But Jean Bower was the exact opposite. She had an acute, some people might have said an absurd, sense of honor. It would have seemed to her dishonest to try and worm a secret, even a little secret, out of a child. She wondered uneasily how she could see Lucy Warren without Miss Prince becoming aware she had done so. And then fortune favored her, for as she took the turn which would soon bring her to Terriford, she saw Lucy Warren coming toward her. The two met in the middle of the field path, and Jean saw an eager look leap to Lucy's eyes. Lucy would have passed any other young lady by with a curt nod, but this particular young lady was not only always kindly and even friendly in her manner, but was also the heroine of the most exciting affair which had ever happened in the recollection of the whole neighborhood. "Lucy, I'm so glad to meet you." And then Jean held out her hand. The other grasped it warmly. "You do look bad, miss," she exclaimed, real concern in her voice. "I feel very tired," faltered Jean. "Won't you come to the farm and rest a bit? There's only Mother there." "I'd rather stay out here. Oh, Lucy, I know that you have it in your power to help Mr. Garlett." With the caution always shown by the more intelligent of her class when face to face with the unknown, Lucy Warren remained silent for a while, gazing, however, fixedly into Jean Bower's troubled face. "How might that be?" she asked at last. "The gentleman who is to defend Mr. Garlett says it's all important to find out who was with him in the wood the night you saw him there," answered Jean in a trembling voice. "I do implore you to tell me who it was, Lucy." "I promised Mother I wouldn't say nothing," said Lucy hesitatingly. "But your mother's a good woman. She wouldn't want you to keep anything back that might save an innocent man," cried Jean wildly. "I always said to Mother that I should have to say something sooner or later." Jean stared at the girl in breathless suspense. "The young lady as met Mr. Garlett in the wood," said Lucy at length, "was Miss Cheel." "Miss Cheel? Are you sure of that, Lucy?" There was deep disappointment, instinctive relief, and a touch of incredulity in the way in which Jean Bower repeated the name of the young lady who for a year had been an inmate of the thatched house. Lucy moved a little closer to Jean Bower. "Us servants," she said meaningly, "knows a lot more than we're meant to know. We all knew well enough that Miss Cheel fair doted on Mr. Garlett, though he was always trying not to see it. Why, sometimes she'd be talking about him in her sleep." Jean Bower's face, from pale, became very red. Could this be true, or was it only an example of the kind of vulgar, dangerous gossip of which she now knew village life to be ever full? "What I'd like to ask Miss Cheel," went on Lucy in an excited voice, "and what ought to be asked her, is why she told them lies about them strawberries." "Lies?" repeated Jean in an oppressed tone. "I don't understand, Lucy. What lies did Miss Cheel tell?" "She told your uncle, miss, that Mr. Garlett had given the missus some strawberries that had been left for her by Miss Prince. Well, that was just a lie. Them strawberries were there on a chest of drawers in the corridor outside Mrs. Garlett's room in the early afternoon. I saw them there myself. Then they just vanished off the chest of drawers,
long before Mr. Garlett went into Mrs. Garlett's room. I can swear to that. I happens to have a special reason for remembering it, for he said to me, 'Lucy,
Will you please go in and ask Mrs. Garlett if she can see me now?'
and I says I, 'No, sir, I don't feel I can do that. The missus is so angry with me about last night.' So I went and got the housemaid to go in, and that's why it remained so plain in my mind." "You mean," said Jean slowly, "that the strawberries disappeared early in the afternoon?" "Aye, that's what I do mean," said Lucy confidently. "They were there, a good helpin', not more, on one of them small dishes belonging to the best dessert service."
"Who do you think gave them to Mrs. Garlett?"
Lucy hesitated. "If it comes to that, the missus may have got them for herself."
"I thought she never went into the passage."
"She came downstairs in the middle of the night, spry enough," said the girl bitterly.
"Besides, there's nothing to prove that she got the poison with them strawberries."
"It's only an idea."
But Jean was hardly listening, for her mind was full of something very different. "You are quite sure, Lucy, that it was Miss Cheel who was in the wood with Mr. Garlett?"
"I'm more than sure. I saw her quite plain."
"Then there's nothing more to be said, but I'm bitterly disappointed," said Jean sadly. "Somehow I had hoped that whoever was in the wood with Mr. Garlett would—" she did not quite know how to frame her meaning, "would, well, provide a clue," she ended. Lucy gave an odd glance at Jean. She felt very sorry for Dr. McLean's niece.
"Miss Cheel was in the village the very day Mr. Garlett was sent for trial," she muttered.
"That's impossible," said Jean quickly. "She was ill in London that day. Her evidence had to be read. She couldn't have been anywhere near Grendon."
"She was at our place, at the thatched cottage, early that afternoon, and in an awful state, too. I heard her tell Miss Prince that she knew Mr. Garlett was innocent."
"You heard her say that?"
"Yes, I did," went on Lucy excitedly. "And don't you forget that it was Miss Cheel who always saw to Mrs. Garlett's food."
She had got it out now, that suspicion, that almost certainty, that hope that had long tormented her. "But why," asked Jean in an oppressed, bewildered tone, "should Miss Cheel do such an awful thing?" She felt as if she were living through one of her terrible nightmares.
"Miss Cheel," said Lucy firmly, "thought that if she could get Mrs. Garlett out of the way, Mr. Garlett maybe would marry her."
"I can't believe that, Lucy."
"Anyway, she was terribly upset when she heard that you and him was going to be married. She took on awful. I heard what she said to Miss Prince, though they thought as how I was out. I had come in unbeknown to them and heard it all. Again and again she asked, 'But is it true, Mary, or just gossip?' And Miss Prince, she kept on saying, 'It is true, Agatha, only too true. I asked Mrs. McLean, and she admitted it. Then she says, 'You must pull yourself together and call on your pride.'"
"Do you think it would be any good if I went into Miss Prince and asked her about Miss Cheel?" asked Jean in a hesitating tone. "I mean, couldn't she ask Miss Cheel what she meant by saying that she knew that Mr. Garlett was innocent?" A look of terror came into Lucy's face. "Oh, miss, you won't go and do that. It would get me into terrible trouble. They're such friends. She'd never say a word against Miss Cheel. I know she wouldn't. Why, Miss Prince had a letter from her this very morning. That's why I'm here now. Miss Cheel wrote as how the woman who keeps the place where she's living in London can't get any help, and Miss Prince thought my sister might go, just to oblige. Not much, but of course I couldn't but say I'd ask." "Can you give me Miss Cheel's address?" asked Jean in a stifled tone. Lucy began hunting in the narrow pocket of her ulster. "Not that you'll get anything out of her. She's an artful one, she is." She held out a crumpled piece of paper. "Required from next Monday a respectable young woman to help. Previous experience not essential. Wages 15 shillings a week, and all found. A comfortable home for the right person. Apply Mrs. Lightfoot, 106 Coburg Square." Jean Bauer gazed down at the piece of paper now in her hand for some time. Lucy was looking at her anxiously, not liking to speak. Had she been wise to confide her great secret, her frightful half-suspicion of the woman she hated, to this young lady? At last Jean turned round. "Lucy," she said, "I'm going to trust you with a secret." She spoke with a touch of solemnity which impressed the girl. "I'm going to London to take this situation offered by—" she looked again at the paper, "Mrs. Lightfoot." "You never are!" "It's my only chance of getting at Miss Cheel, of finding out anything she may know. I can't believe, that she had anything direct to do with the poisoning of Mrs. Garlett, but she may know who did it. And now I want to know if I may go to the thatched farm and write out 2 telegrams, one to Mrs. Lightfoot, the other to a friend of mine with whom I mean to spend tonight in London. Would you take them for me to the post office?" "That I will," said Lucy. As they walked toward the farm together, it was as if there sounded loudly in Jean's ear the words Sir Harold Anstey had uttered a couple of days ago. "Find the man or woman who wrote those anonymous letters, and I promise to save your lover's life." Jean Bower now felt that she knew who had written those letters. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of the Terriford Mystery by Marie Belloc Lowndes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21. To Jean Bower, it was an extraordinary stroke of good fortune that today, for the first time for many weeks, Dr. McLean had persuaded his wife to accept an invitation to luncheon. Thanks to that circumstance, the overwrought girl was able to go back to Bonny Doon, pack a small bag containing the clothes she felt she must take with her, write a short note to the kind folk to whom she stood in so curious a relation, and finally enjoy a comforting talk with Elsie McTaggart. Somehow she now felt more at ease with Elsie than with either her uncle or aunt. Elsie was a wholehearted believer in Harry Garlett's innocence, and a believer, too, that he was sure to come out, as she put it, all right. So it was that at the very last moment before quitting Bonny Doon, she knew for not how long, Jean went into the kitchen and took tight hold of Elsie's work-worn hand. "I'm going away, Elsie," she said, "in order to do something that may help Mr. Garlett. I can't say more, and if I did, they wouldn't approve." The girl continued, somewhat bitterly, "They've wanted me to go away. They've longed for me to go away. Well, now I am going away. I don't know for how long. Here's a note in which I've given an address where I can be written to, and of course I'll let them know how I am now and again." Then, as she heard the sound of a motor, the color rushed to her face. "They can't be back yet," she exclaimed in a dismayed tone. Elsie smiled. "That's the machine I just telephoned for to Grendon. You were never going to walk to the station. That would have been a foolish thing to do, when maybe you have some hard days in front of you." Jean took Elsie in her arms and hugged her. Then she kissed her on both cheeks. "Goodbye, Elsie. I know that you wish me well." "Aye, indeed, I'll be doing that." And so, very quietly and without consulting anybody, Jean Bower started on what was to be her great adventure. It was such a comfort to feel that, to Rachel North at least, she owed no explanations that she did not choose to give, no duty of any sort, only gratitude for present kindness done. It was also soothing to know that in London she would be but one of millions of people intent on their own business and not on hers. How different from a place where she could hardly walk a few steps in the daylight without knowing that even the village children were pointing her out to each other. Cuthbert Street, Belgravia? The address sounded grand to her country ears, but she knew that Rachel North in faraway days had had a large circle of friends. Perhaps it was some kindly survivor of those distant days who had lent her a flat. On and on her taxi took her through the dark streets, for it was a late Saturday afternoon, and to Jean, looking out of the windows, the long dreary streets seemed to grow shabbier and shabbier. At last it turned into a thoroughfare which seemed interminable, and of which the houses had that depressing, almost terrible look of having seen better days. The plaster was peeling off the stucco walls, and here and there a window was broken. There was a look of indescribable grime and dirt, even on the pavements. At last the driver drew up opposite the very last house in the street, one that overlooked a railway bridge. "I reckon it's here," he said, looking round dubiously. Jean told herself that there must be some mistake. The house looked even more forlorn than did its neighbors, and while she was glancing up at the gray, crusted walls and dirty windows, she heard the shriek of a train, and a moment later there came a deafening roar. "Come, miss, this is 200 Cuthbert Street right enough. You give me my fare and let me go off," said the man rather roughly. "I'm on another job in a few minutes, and this is such an out-of-the-way part." She paid him the big sum marked on the taximeter, took her hold all out of the cab, and with a slight sensation of fear, as well as of deep surprise, She pressed the top one of the 4 knobs, which seemed to indicate that the house had 4 occupiers. For what seemed a considerable while, nothing happened, and she pressed the second knob. Then at last, a slatternly-looking woman opened the door and looked at her disagreeably. "You're not wanting Mrs. Strafford?" she asked. "Does Rachel North live here? I've come to stay with her," said Jean, trembling a little. "As I've had the trouble of opening the door to you, you can walk up. It's the top floor. But you'd no business to press my bell." I'm sorry," faltered Jean. "We're not allowed to put our names outside the door, and it's a shame that it is. I'm always coming up from my basement just to open the door to some other lady's visitors." The woman turned round, leaving the front door open. Jean shut it and began slowly walking up the narrow, dark staircase. The house looked more than dirty. It looked degraded. On and on she went, past frowsy-looking landings, till she reached the top floor. There, a change indeed. A piece of linoleum, scrupulously clean, was on the landing, and as she moved cautiously forward and knocked on the door opposite the top of the staircase, a voice which had once been very familiar called out, "Come in!" She turned the handle and saw before her a plainly furnished but pleasant little sitting-room, and a girl who she knew was Rachel North rose from a low chair by the fire and came forward. "Why, Jean, I didn't expect you for another hour. I looked out the trains from Grendon. You must have come by a slow one." "I did," she answered rather breathlessly. "I was in such a hurry to get away." "I know, to get busy," said the other, nodding her head. She was a reserved girl, and she did not kiss Jean Bower. Instead, she took both her visitor's hands, held them firmly, and gazed into her face. "I won't say much," she exclaimed, "but I should like you to know that I do understand what you are feeling, what you are going through, and I'll do everything in my power to help you. You know I'm engaged all day. I'm so glad today happened to be a Saturday. But for that, I should not have got your telegram until after you arrived in London." And then she drew Jean toward the bright little fire. "It isn't a bad place," she said critically, "once one's up here. The rest of the house is filthy." She took Jean's hold-all. "Is this all you've brought?" "Yes," said Jean, and there crept a tone of defiance into her voice. "I think I may as well tell you at once why I've come to London. I'm going to take a place on Monday as general servant in a house where someone lives who, I believe, might help, if she chose to prove Harry's innocence." "I see," said Rachel North slowly. "A bit of detective work? Knowing how sensible you used to be, I suppose that you're acting under advice, eh?" "Not altogether, but yes, I think I may say I'm acting under advice. Perhaps I ought to go out now and get clothes of the kind needed for that sort of work?" There came a troubled look into her face, and the older girl felt touched, even a little amused. "Don't you worry about clothes," she exclaimed. "I came very low down in the world at one time, and I've kept the things I wore then. They're awfully shabby, but they're quite clean. I don't know why I kept them. It was a sort of superstitious feeling. I felt that if I gave them away, I might want them again. But now, well, my dear, you know I've all sorts of queer ideas. Now I think I was probably intended to keep them, that I might help you." That this question should be settled so easily and so well was more of a relief than perhaps Jean would have admitted even to herself. She had given the matter of her outfit for 106 Coburg Square a good deal of anxious thought on her railway journey. She realized that the whole of her scheme would fail if the woman to whose employment she was going suspected that she was playing a part. She was too sensible to suppose that she would be able to pass herself off as a simple country girl of the working class, but she did hope that she would be able to make her employer believe that she was out to earn an honest living, in however humble a capacity. And then, after they had enjoyed their cold supper, and while Jean was lying back in an extraordinarily comfortable couch, which yet looked oddly big for the little room, her friend exclaimed, "Perhaps I'd better tell you now that you're really on what's going to be your bed. I've thought it over, and though I should have been delighted to give you my bedroom and have slept in here, I somehow felt that you'd far rather sleep here and leave me my bedroom, eh?" "Indeed, indeed I would," exclaimed Jean. "I know," the other nodded. "I once went to stay with a friend, and I can't tell you what I felt when I discovered the next day that she turned out of her room and slept in the kitchen." Jean Bower awoke to find her friend smiling down at her. There was a cup of tea in her hand. "Now then, you just drink this up. Then I'll light the fire, and after I've done that, I'll bring you those clothes I told you about. I've just had a look at them. They're old-fashioned and ugly, But I don't know that that really matters. After all, your object is to look the part." Jean sat up and drank the tea thirstily. Oh, how restful to be here with this quiet, reserved young woman, who, while obviously sympathizing with her, was not in the least inquisitive. She caught Rachel North's hand and pulled her down. "You know I'm grateful to you, without my saying so," she whispered. "I shall never forget how good you've been." "I've not been more good to you than 2 or 3 women were to me in my deep trouble, but I took my trouble in a way I hope you will never do, Jean," replied the other girl. "I cut myself off from everybody after my father's death. I was wrong in that. I see it now. But I was so unhappy." Her face altered. It became convulsed with feeling, and she turned quickly away, busying herself in making and lighting the fire. Then she went off into her room and came back with a curious little heap of garments in her arms. There was a brown serge coat and skirt, the skirt unfashionably full, while the coat was short and skimpy. Then there were 2 clean, washed-out-looking flannel blouses. "This, I take it, is the sort of thing you want? But I strongly advise you to buy some thick woolen underwear. After all, the woman won't see what you're wearing underneath your coat and skirt." "How clever you are, Rachel. I should never have thought of that," said Jean admiringly. "You don't want to go and fall ill the first day you're there, especially as you'll have need of an alert mind. I'm afraid you'll have very nasty food." "I don't mind that," said Jean quickly. "Oh, don't you? Well, you wait a bit. It's easy to talk like that. I've come to think that nice food is one of the most important things in the world. If I were you, I should take some malted milk or cod liver oil and malt in your trunk." "Trunk?" queried Jean doubtfully. "A good, big, deep suitcase rather than a wooden box. The woman who's going to employ you won't think you're bringing such a thing queer at all. In fact, I think she'd think it odd if you came with practically nothing but a hold-all." "I suppose that's true," said Jean. "All right, I put myself in your hands. You shall tell me what to do." Rachel North smiled. She was one of those women who love power and, given the chance, exercise it wisely. "If you don't mind getting up a bit early on Monday morning, there's a place close by here, a great big cheap store where all the working girls go. We'll get some kind of suitcase there, and we'll buy 2 sets of their best warm underclothing. If your employer should see them by any chance, you can say they were given you by a kind lady." And then they both burst into peals of girlish laughter. Jean had not laughed so heartily as that for many a long day. "By the way, have you chosen a good name to call yourself by?" "I'm going as Elizabeth Chart, my mother's maiden name." And the laughter died out of her eyes. Suddenly Rachel said, "I must go out and get my Sunday papers. When one is leading a lonely life, one does depend tremendously on reading, and I'm not ashamed to say it, on newspaper reading. Papers are my only luxury, and on Sundays I have a regular debauch." Jean was staring into the fire. "I suppose you've read everything that's been printed about, and then she said rather defiantly, "about Harry and me? I know there must have been horrid things, for Uncle Jock made me promise not to look at the papers, not even at the paper they take in at Bonny Doon." "Yes," said Rachel North reluctantly. "I have seen a good deal about you, Jean, but everything so far about you has been kind." And then Jean jumped up from her chair. "I hate that!" she exclaimed. "I'd far rather they said horrible things, as I know they do about Harry." "They have to be careful," said Rachel North in a detached tone. "No paper is allowed to prejudge a case." "Yet they do prejudge it!" exclaimed Jean Bower excitedly. "Well, yes, in a sense, I'm afraid they do." When Rachel North came back, she handed the bundle of papers to Jean and began bustling in and out of her tiny kitchen, getting dinner ready, a delicate little bit of undercut which was to be served French fashion with fried potatoes and some salad. Jean began looking at one of the papers listlessly. Then all at once she realized that in the middle of the big sheet was a square space, and within it, running ribbon-wise across the top, ran, "The Terriford Mystery, an exciting development. Exclusive to the Sunday Critic. The Sunday Critic learns, on absolutely reliable authority, that the prosecution believe that they are at last on the track of the one missing link in the Terriford Mystery. That Mrs. Emily Garlett died from a large dose of white arsenic is certain, but till 2 days ago there was no clue as to where the murderer, the murderess, or the murderers had obtained the poison. This doubt, so we are credibly informed, is on the point of being solved. The discovery has not changed the present situation, and no further arrests are contemplated." Jean read the paragraph again and again. Then she called out, Rachel, come here and tell me what this means." Rachel North hurried into the room. She knelt down by the girl's side and read the paragraph. "It means," she said in a quiet, matter-of-fact voice, "that if this paper is to be believed, the prosecution have found where the arsenic was purchased. The implication is that it was purchased by Mr. Garlett, hence those words, 'The situation is unchanged. No further arrests are contemplated.'" And then something happened which, though it terrified Rachel North, gave a few moments of merciful oblivion to Jean Bower. The supple, rounded figure, full of the strength of living life, suddenly sagged. She would have fallen on the floor had not the other caught hold of her. But Rachel North's hospital training stood her in good stead. She laid the unconscious form flat on the floor, and rushing off to her bedroom, came back with some sal volatile, which she forced through Jean's lips. And at last, with a low moan, the girl regained consciousness. After a few moments, she struggled up to her knees. Then she looked round her, dazed, forgetting where she was and what had happened. But all too soon, everything rushed back into her mind. Painfully, she lifted herself up again onto the chair. "I want to read that paragraph again," she said in a trembling voice. "I want to understand exactly what it means." "I don't think you will be able to do that, dear. It's put in that odd, uncertain way on purpose. But honestly, Jean, I don't think you need attach much importance to it." And then, for the first time since her arrival, Jean Bower had a heart-to-heart talk with Rachel North over the whole mysterious story. They discussed every alternative possibility, and, as so often happens, Jean began to feel happier, more self-controlled, as a result of that long talk. One thing which greatly comforted her was that after hearing all she had to say, Rachel North suddenly exclaimed, "I think I was wrong as to what I said to you. I mean, as to the prosecution having found the place where Mr. Garlett may have purchased arsenic. What I think has happened is that they have found something in the thatched house from which arsenic can be extracted. Now, apparently, arsenic can be extracted from almost anything. That being so, it would be strange indeed if nothing of the sort had been found." "That's true," said Jean, "and yet—" Her face clouded over. "And yet, Rachel, they've left no stone unturned. One might say that literally, to find arsenic in the thatched house." Rachel North took her friend's hand. "You will want all your wits about you during this experiment that you are going to try. If you allow yourself to be unnerved by what has been published by that paper, then I'm afraid you'll injure your chance of success. From all you tell me, I agree with you that that woman, Agatha Cheel, knows far more than she has chosen to tell. Her behavior after Mr. Garlett was committed for trial, I mean her behavior in coming down to see Miss Prince, is to my mind almost an indication that she knows something she is unwilling to reveal. Now I wonder, perhaps you'll be shocked at what I'm going to say, Jean. I wonder if Miss Cheel, well, to put it plainly, was fond of Mr. Garlett?" Jean looked at Rachel. "Yes," she said slowly. "I'm afraid Miss Cheel did care for Harry, and it's because I can't help suspecting that she had something to do with the writing of those anonymous letters that I am going to the house where she is living. She's only seen me twice in her life. I feel sure she won't know me again, and as I've already told you, Sir Harold Anstey thinks it's all important that I should find out who wrote those letters." "I agree," said Rachel quickly. "Whoever wrote those letters was either instigated by the most fiendish spite and simply wanted to make Mr. Garlett miserable for nothing, or else he or she must have known that if an exhumation should take place, arsenic would certainly be found in Mrs. Garlett's body." "I think Agatha Cheel wrote those letters to make Harry wretched, to punish him for not having loved her. If I thought she knew Mrs. Garlett was poisoned, then I should regard her as—" She broke off in what she was going to say, and the other exclaimed, "A murderess? Yes, that's the only logical conclusion." End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of the Terriford Mystery by Marie Belloc Lowndes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. "Can you tell me the shortest way to Coburg Square?"
"It's round by the Foundling Hospital. I'm going that way myself, so you'd best come along with me."
The man peered through the dark, fog-laden air into the young, pale face, looking up at him from under the brim of a singularly unbecoming, plain brown straw hat. He was an old bachelor who never, if he could help it, spoke to a woman, but he had been mollified by the sweetness of her voice. The Foundling Hospital? It was a comfort to her in her present forlorn condition to think of all that that great house of human pity and sympathy had done for innumerable deserted and friendless orphans. For the first time in her life she was assailed by that most unnerving of companions, Little Devil Doubt. What she was about to do was surely a terrible risk. If she failed, as she might well fail, and her desperate enterprise were to become known, would she not be universally condemned? Might it not even get into the papers? Harry Garlett's betrothed taking a place as a servant for his sake? She could almost picture the terrible headlines. She felt so nervous, so excited, that when the deep voice of her conductor suddenly interrupted her anxious self-questioning, she stumbled and would have fallen had not he put out his hand.
"If you just turn down to the left here," said the man, "and then turn sharp to the right, the house you want will be within 3 or 4 of the corner of the square."
In response to her word of thanks, he took off his hat and went his way. Jean then walked on slowly, and now and again she stopped. This was her last chance to change her mind, to give up what she well knew most of the people who had known and respected her in her short life would consider a crazy adventure. When she came to the end of the long street which led into the square, she pressed her cold hand across her face. Her eyes were smarting, partly with the fog, partly from the tears she had shed in the night. She felt unutterably sad and discouraged, and yet deep in her heart she longed to engage in what she believed would be a duel between herself and that strange woman, Agatha Cheel. If Lucy Warren's tale were true, Agatha Cheel was the one person in the world who had had a vital reason for desiring Mrs. Garlett's death. Throwing off Little Devil Doubt, Jean decided to go on. She crossed over to the corner house of the square. To her left she could dimly discern the railings of the narrow garden facing the dark houses to her right. There was no one in sight, and she felt strangely eerie walking along the wide, uneven pavement, trying to make out the number on each door. Even the street lamps seemed to gleam more dimly here than elsewhere. She found 109. Then the glooming-looking unlit house with the portico must be 106. Blindly she groped for a bell, and at last she felt a row of knobs. As her fingers slid over them uncertainly, there came over her a sudden feeling of acute fear. What if Agatha Cheel should open the door and recognize her? Then she told herself that her fear was absurd. She had only met Miss Cheel twice. The first time in the cricket pavilion, where Mrs. Garlett's housekeeper had been absorbed in looking after the numerous guests and their entertainment. Then again, for a few moments on the morning when Miss Cheel, livid with anger, was giving notice to Lucy Warren. And on that day she, Jean Bower, had been wearing a large hat which completely shadowed her face. And then, with intense relief, she reminded herself that, of course, her way of entrance should be by the back door. Creeping out from under the dark portico, she felt along the iron railings. Yes, here was the area gate, and luckily it was unlatched. She pushed it open and found that it led to a steep stone staircase. Down she went, feeling her way from one worn step to the next, till she reached the bottom. She was now in a small pit-like yard, and to her right, from behind what was evidently the kitchen window of the cavernous old house, there shone a bright light. As she could see no door, she knocked at last timidly on the window. A moment later a narrow door was opened wide, and she walked through into a stone passage lighted by a gas jet, while a not unkindly voice exclaimed, "You're Elizabeth Chart, I take it? Didn't think you'd come for another hour, my dear. Come into my kitchen, do, and I'll have some tea ready for you in a jiffy." The speaker was a gray-haired, red-faced woman, immensely stout and dressed in an old-fashioned alpaca dress. She wore a paisley shawl neatly pinned across her vast breast with a cameo brooch. "Elizabeth's a mouthful, so if you don't mind, I'll call you Bet." "I'll like that," faltered the girl. "Now then, Bet, you go right into my kitchen and get warm. 'Twill be a great relief to me, I reckon, having a country girl after them London sluts. I was that pleased when I got the telegram saying you was comin' this afternoon that I could 'a' danced." It was a homely-looking kitchen with a big red fire in the old-fashioned, wasteful grate. The bright light the girl had seen from outside came from a chandelier hanging in the middle of the ceiling. Under the light the two faced one another, Mrs. Lightfoot, the housekeeper, and Bet Chart, the new servant. With thankfulness, Bet noticed that her employer had a shrewd, good-humored face, and in spite of her huge girth, a brisk, cheerful way of moving about.
"'Tain't no good taking you upstairs yet. You can just pop your things off in my room. This way, please."
She led the way into what had evidently once been the butler's pantry in the stately old house.
"I'd a like to have had you near me, my dear, but I wouldn't keep a dog's kennel in any of the other rooms in this 'ere basement. They're that damp and dark."
A fire was burning in the room they were now in, and by its light Jean saw a big bed and some nice old-fashioned furniture.
"This room and next door to it is my own," said Mrs. Lightfoot with pride. "You'll sleep under the roof. I goes up and down as little as I can, for though I used to live up to my husband's name, I can't do with stairs. Still, I can move about quick, as you'll soon see. Like to wash your hands? You can do it in my basin as a treat today, but henceforth you'll have to wash 'em at the sink."
A few moments later Jean came back into the kitchen. She felt very strange and odd in her full brown skirt, her flannel blouse, and the neat, Quaker-like little white muslin cap she and Rachel North had bought that morning.
"That's right," exclaimed Mrs. Lightfoot. "Not ashamed to wear a cap, as was our last fine lady. A little treasure you're setting out to be. The last hussy I had here, she's got a job as a demonstrator, putting rouge on her lips and whitening her face. I reckon that'll suit her ladyship for the present, till she moves on to, I won't demean myself by saying where."
She had set out bread, butter, and jam on the kitchen table. Then, apparently afraid lest her praise should make her new help uppish, she observed critically, "You don't look over strong for a country girl. Mind you, there's stairs here. Stairs, 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 all the time." "I'm very strong," said Jean in a low voice. "It's only that I'm tired today. You see, I've come a long way."
"Aye, that's true, and not over familiar with London, I dare say."
"I don't know London at all." Jean looked straight into the other's fat face. She was glad to be able to say something which was absolutely true.
"There now, fancy that. You surprise me, seeing that I can see you've had some education. I'm a Londoner born and bred, proud of it, too. It's unlucky you and me can't go out together. I take you to see the sights, but you'll be able to go here and there on your afternoon off. A young girl like you won't be long before she gets a friend to walk out with."
To that Jean made no answer. Instead, she sat down and poured herself out a cup of tea.
"As you come from Terriford, I expect you're quite familiar like with all the parties concerned with this here Garlett murder. The thatched house mystery, some calls it. Ever seen my top floor? Miss Cheel? She's in it, of course."
"I don't think I've ever seen her," faltered Jean. She bent her face down to her plate. "I wasn't in Terriford long."
"I'll give you a peep at Miss Cheel some time or other," said Miss Lightfoot kindly. "But she's the one of my lodgers you won't have much to do with. I do the waiting on her myself. She simply can't abear strangers. But you'll have to help her do her room, mind you. What the hear don't hear, the art don't grieve at. She thinks I never lets anyone into her room, but there she's mistaken. I can't do all the work, and it's lucky for me that my front ground floor's been empty a while, though now you've come, my dear, I don't mind how soon it fills up."
Jean's hands were shaking. How stupid, how idiotic of her not to have realized that Agatha Cheel's connection with the thatched house would be known to Mrs. Lightfoot.
"She's taken on awful about that case," went on the housekeeper. "She left here over a year ago to go to that very Mrs. Garlett as lady housekeeper. I says to her then, 'You're a fool to give up your independence, Miss Cheel, my dear,' but she would do it, and see where it's landed her."
"Has Miss Cheel ever told you how she thinks Mrs. Garlett was poisoned?" asked Jean.
"I simply wouldn't dare ask her. I have tried once or twice to sort of lead on to it delicately, but she can't bear the littlest question about it. Oh, she's a fly one. It wasn't till I seed her name in the paper that she let on she'd anything to do with it. Since then, well, it stands to reason. She's had to say just a bit about it to me now and again. What's upset her so has been those dratted lawyers, first one side, then the other, coming and worrying her something awful. That's why she's had to speak to me about it, so that I could prevent 'em coming up to her. And I have prevented 'em," exclaimed Mrs. Lightfoot. Unconsciously, she put her arms akimbo and assumed a fighting attitude. "Many a fine bold lie have I told in her good cause. Be spot truthful when you're young, but as time goes on, allow yourself a little law. That's a motto for you, bet chart, and a good one, too. After all, Miss Cheel can't say what she don't know, can she?"
"No one knows anything," said Jean at last. "It's a terrible, terrible mystery," and she pushed her plate away.
"Now you just go on eating, Bet. It's real butter, no cheap margarine for me. Never would have it in my house. for all I've come down in the world, as the saying is. During the war, plain honest drippin' as I got off a chef I know. Since then, the best butter. You'll find I live up to what I said, a comfortable 'ome for a suitable person." So Jean forced herself to eat a bit more of Mrs. Lightfoot's excellent bread and butter. "In a way, 'tis a mystery," went on her employer, "though in another way 'tis no mystery at all. Young man marries old woman for her money, gets fair sick of her, meets a pretty young girl, takes a fancy to her, and does away with the old un. So far, all clear. As I says to Miss Cheel early this very morning, 'Don't you take on so, miss. It's 'appened plenty o' times before, and it'll 'appen plenty o' times again, before the judgment day. Anyway,' I says, 'it'll be all the same 100 years hence.' But between you and me, Bet Chart, I've another idea."
"There are some people who think that perhaps Mrs. Garlett poisoned herself," said Jean. She had given up the pretense of eating and was now looking fixedly into Mrs. Lightfoot's red face.
"Well, that I never will believe. Not if the king himself come out of Buckingham Palace and commanded me to do so. I've read pretty well everything that's been written about this 'ere so-called mystery. I makes a special study of murders, always have done so, though it turns me faint to drown a newborn kitten in warm water. I've been found right many a time, and that afore the judge and jury have made up their minds."
"And what do you think now?" asked Jean eagerly.
"More than once I've asked myself whether that forward hussy, Jean Bower, did it. She had every reason to want the poor soul out of the way, but it don't look at present as if she'd ever had the chance."
"No," said Bet Chart quietly. "Jean Bower never even saw Mrs. Garlett."
"That, beggin' your pardon, Bet, may be a tale. I don't see 'ow you could know, anyway. It would have been strange if they'd never met, livin' in the same place, and both bein' gentry. And she, the doctor's niece. What's she like? I suppose you've seen her?"
"Yes," said Jean, "I've seen her. She's just ordinary, like everybody else."
"They're generally the worst," said Mrs. Lightfoot. "Very much the worst, if you'll believe me. I've given a lot of study to that girl. There's someone a protectin' her, not a doubt of it. Else why wasn't she called when that man Harry Garlett was committed for his trial? She ought to have been. They did their level best to try and compel my poor top floor to go to Grendon Town. She had to have a doctor, and he had to give her a certificate. And even that wasn't enough. We had a lawyer here, a man from the Crown, he called hisself. But I don't believe for 1 minute the king knew the way he went on. 'Ow he worried that poor young woman. She made me stay in the room all the time, and a good thing, too. There he was, close up to her bed, with a big book and a fountain pen. Why, it wasn't decent. She wouldn't eat any supper after that. She cried and cried, and I was fair tormented about her. Yet they left that Bower girl, that forward sly hussy, absolutely alone. What do you say to that?"
"They didn't leave her absolutely alone," said Jean slowly. "Someone came from the Crown to see her and cross-examine her, too."
"I'm glad of that," said Mrs. Lightfoot. "Very glad, indeed. That's the best word I've heard you say, Bet Chart, about the whole business. I'm intended to get in at that trial, even if I'm crushed to death doing so. It'll take the place of my summer outing. I don't often go in for that sort of treat, but I did see the brides in the bath, man. I saw him black-capped."
"How dreadful," whispered the help, and she turned even whiter than she had been before.
"I had a friend at the Old Bailey, one of the judge's clerks. My husband's uncle was Mr. Justice Bonnerby's clerk, and that gives me a sort of connection with the law. So they're very kind to me when I goes down to the Old Bailey, and I could get in much oftener than I does if I could leave the house. Still, as I hopes and believes he'll be here when Henry Garlett's trial takes place, I'll just give myself the treat of seeing my poor Miss Cheel in the witness box." She waited a moment to take a breath, and then added significantly, "You just look over there." Jean turned round quickly to see a great pile of newspapers lying in a corner of the kitchen. "Miss Cheel takes in 5 newspapers a day, if you'll believe me, just with the idea of seeing something new about that awful affair. If it had been wartime, I could have made my fortune out of them old papers, but now the dustman wants to be paid for carrying 'em away. But there, I do get something out of it, for of course I reads them all, when I have the time, that is. As for Miss Cheel, she just pores over them, and every one of the Sunday papers she takes in too. I haven't had time yet to look over yesterday's, but I will this even, and it'll be a treat for you too, Bet. There was something in one of them papers as greatly upset Miss Cheel. She wouldn't say naught about it, but I knew. It's never out of her mind, that it isn't. She even talks about it in her sleep. My last girl used to hear her, and it fair gave her the creeps."
Hadn't I better begin washing up? Asked Jean timidly.
Well, yes, I reckon you had. All the people in this house goes out to work for their daily bread. Leastways, all but one does. I won't have no drones if I can help it. No drones, and no, you can guess what sort I mean, for all you're an innocent young thing. I could have made a lot of money, retired too, and lived in peace and plenty, if I hadn't been a respectable woman. But there, I can't help it. I just am.
Jean made no reply to that obviously truthful statement. Instead, she carried the tea things she had used, one after the other, to the broad sink.
"Hello," called out Mrs. Lightfoot suddenly. "Ever heard of a tray?"
The girl turned round, surprised. "How stupid of me!" she exclaimed, and then suddenly her heart almost stopped beating, for Mrs. Lightfoot walked straight up to her and said,
"You've never been out before? You're not the plain country lass I took you for. What are you?"
"I'm the daughter of a man of business, Mrs. Lightfoot. My father failed before he died. I never was taught to do anything, though I did what I could in a hospital during the war. When I heard of your situation last week, I was on my beam ends." Mrs. Lightfoot looked relieved.
"I guessed you were something, just not quite common," she admitted cautiously. "The way you put your cup to your lips in a sort of finicky way enlightened me. I expect you was sent to a genteel school."
"I suppose I was," said the other almost in a whisper. "But I don't mind hard work. You'll see I don't." And then suddenly she began to cry. I've been so unhappy," she gasped, "since my father died."
There, you'll be happy here. Don't you worry, and don't you go and think, as many a silly young girl supposes nowadays, that all the good chaps were killed in the war. If there's only one left, you'll find him right enough, and if not, I'll find him for you. There's some good elderly gents about, too, just now. Better be an old man's darling than a young man's slave. Any old barn door can keep out the draft, but no carryings on with the lodgers, mind. But there, I won't insult you, Bet, my dear, by supposing you capable of doing such a thing. Likewise, you won't have a chance, for I does most of the waitin' on the gentlemen myself."
Then came 3 knocks on the floor above the kitchen ceiling. "What's that?" exclaimed the new help.
"My invalid, a mystery he is, Mr. Gee by name, though not his real one, between you and me and the lamppost. But you'll have nothing to do with him."
She went off upstairs, then came back and said suddenly,
"Can you cook at all, my dear, or shall I have to teach you that, as well as the use of a tray?"
But Mrs. Lightfoot spoke very good-humoredly. "I can cook simple things," said Jean, "and I know some nice Scotch breakfast dishes."
"I don't want you to go a-spoilin' my lodgers. Plain and good, that's my motto. Eggs and bacon weekdays, and midget sausages on Sunday for a treat. My gentleman pays for bed and breakfast, and though it's near double what it was afore the war, yet it needs a good bit more contrivin' than it did then, I can tell you. As to Miss Cheel, well, she goes on another plan. I just buys what she wants. She makes a tidy bit of money out of them Russians she works for. Besides, as you may have heard, she was left a little fortune by that poor poisoned soul."
At 6:30 there came the sound of the big front door opening. Then it was shut slowly, carefully.
"That's Mr. Robbins," remarked Mrs. Lightfoot. "He's a very careful gentleman. Always the first to come in, for the reason he works near here at the British Museum. A proper, quiet sort of man, though they do say he was a regular devil in the war. But there, he's settled down peaceful nicely now. He's got my big front drawing-room, and beautiful he's made it with some things his ma left him when she died."
Something like a quarter of an hour went by, and then again there came the sound of the front door opening. This time it was banged to.
"Mr. Goodbody," said the housekeeper. "A merry, cheerful little gentleman as lives up to his name. Going to be married, so we shan't keep him long. I'll miss him when he goes. Not that I exactly envy his missus, mind you, but still it's nice to be always greeted with a laugh and a joke." "That's Miss Cheel," exclaimed Mrs. Lightfoot as a church clock near by struck 7. "Sometimes she works even later than this. Her arrival is the signal for me to get busy. I got her a nice chop today. She's going to have fried potatoes with it, fried potatoes and Brussels sprouts. Likewise a meringue. Not one of those bought meringues, all glue and a lick of cream, but a meringue I've got to fill chock full of whipped cream. Miss Cheel knows what she likes, and unlike some folks, she's willing to pay for it."
As she spoke, she got up and began moving about, and when Jean offered to help her, she shook her head.
Let be," she exclaimed. "Nother night I may let you try your hand at Miss Cheel's supper, but tonight I'd better do it, for I knows what she likes, and exactly how she likes it. But I'll tell you what I will let you do. I'll let you carry up the tray as far as the landing. We must take the risk of her seeing you. Morbid, ain't it? Her dislike of seeing people?" 20 minutes later, Jean took the heavily loaded tray and started going up the kitchen stairs. In front of her, treading more and more slowly, more and more wheezily, walked the housekeeper. The gaslight in the hall showed the fine, tessellated black and white pavement and the 2 mahogany doors. As they walked past the door giving into a back room on the ground floor, Jean heard a choking cough. "There he is, poor gentleman, coughing his life away," whispered Mrs. Lightfoot compassionately. "It'll be a mercy for me as well as for him and another I could name, when he's gone. But that sort lingers on, never knowing they're going either." They went on up the first flight, and though there was another gas jet halfway up, the house seemed wrapped in gloom. It was, however, a magnificent remnant of London's 18th century architecture. The banisters of the wide staircase were of wrought iron, and it did not require much imagination to see the beaux and the belles of 150 years ago walking down the wide, low steps, hand in hand. When they reached the drawing-room floor, the door of the back drawing-room opened, and a cheerful, chubby-looking young man's face looked out. "Hullo, Mrs. Heavyfoot, got a lady in waiting at last, eh?" And then the speaker looked hard at the girl carrying the tray. "Here's a pretty miss. Do you know who you remind me of, pretty miss?" "Now, none of your nonsense," said Mrs. Lightfoot sharply. "You're an engaged gentleman, too. Fie, Mr. Goodbody." "You remind me," went on Mr. Goodbody, taking no notice of his landlady, "of a beauteous young female called Pamela. Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded. But I fear me you'll have none of the wondrous adventures that befell Pamela, not while you're under the eagle eye of your present chaperone." Jean made no answer to these facetious remarks, but she looked at him so coldly that the young man felt, as he expressed it to himself, somewhat withered. Quietly he withdrew into his own quarters and shut the door. "He means no harm," panted Mrs. Lightfoot tolerantly. "He's only out for a bit of fun, and yet, would you believe it? His young lady, well, she hardly smiles. I suppose he's tired her with his fun. That's what he's done." On and on they went, and then the housekeeper suddenly said, "Hush." In a low whisper she added, "I sees that her door is open. You just give me that tray, and then when I fixed her up comfortable, you can creep up behind me and I'll show you where you're to sleep. Then I won't have to come up again to show you, see?" And there on the dark staircase the girl waited, it seemed to her for a long time, while murmurs of conversation came from behind the now shut door of Miss Cheel's sitting room. She felt extraordinarily strung up and excited at the thought that there, within a few feet of her, was the woman who claimed to have the key to the mystery of Mrs. Garlett's death. At last Mrs. Lightfoot came out of the brightly lit room and beckoned her to help, and Jean, hurrying on to the landing, saw a narrow, ladder-like staircase. "No need for me to go up. You can't make no mistake, Bet, for only one of the 2 garrets up there has any furniture in it. I don't say you'll find it very comfortable, but 'tain't as if 'twas terrible cold just now. You can move about, too, for all you're just over Miss Cheel's bedroom. They don't build houses like this nowadays. She's in a rare nervy state tonight. She's frightened of a feller that's been hanging about here a lot, name of Kentworthy. He's getting up this case for Henry Garlett, but he don't get much change out of me, though before I knew what he was up to, we became quite friendly-like. Oh, he's an artful one, but he won't get over Jemima Lightfoot, and I told him so flat. Only once did he force his way into this house, and that was when I wasn't in it." End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of the Terriford Mystery by Marie Belloc Lowndes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. With a loud cry of, "What is it? What's the matter?" Jean, in the pitch darkness, sat up in her narrow pallet bed and listened. For a moment or two she didn't know where she was, and fear clutched at her heart. And then, though memory soon came back, it was accompanied by icy waves of terror, and it was with a trembling hand that she lit a candle. It was now quite still and quiet up there under the roof of the huge old house. Then, all at once, the sounds that had awakened her began again. The sound of a loud, discordant voice, or was it 2 voices, that seemed terrifyingly near.
Clasping her hands together nervously, Jean listened intently. It was a high-pitched voice, only one voice after all, uttering quick, eager, argumentative words of which she could not catch the sense. The candle was burning more brightly now, and she looked timorously round her. Mrs. Lightfoot, with all her kind, hearty good nature, had never bethought herself of making the bedroom of her help even a little comfortable. It was a large garret, and the ceiling was so low that it gave its occupant a feeling of being pressed down upon. The flooring boards, which were not over clean, were bare, though by the pallet bed lay a dingy-looking string mat. A tub and minute iron washing stand were in a corner, and a rickety yellow painted chest of drawers stood far away under the dormer window, and on it was the cheapest form of toilet glass made. Jean had laughed when she had looked at herself in it, for so distorted a view of her face had never been presented to her gaze before. But now, sitting up in bed, the thought of that distorting-looking glass gave her a feeling of horror and affright. The one chair in the room was dirty and very shaky. On it there now stood her light, cheap, almost empty suitcase. There were 3 hooks screwed into the door, but she had put her clothes on the bed, for in spite of Mrs. Lightfoot's remark, she had felt very cold. All at once she realized that the voice she heard was Miss Cheel's voice. Leaping out of bed, she caught up her outdoor jacket and put it on. Then, after listening intently, she opened her door, leaving the candle alight. For a moment the darkness baffled her. Then she felt along the wall and at last found the cord which ran down along the side of the dangerous ladder-like stairs. Putting one bare foot slowly, cautiously before the other, down she went, very, very slowly, terrified lest she should make the smallest sound. At last her feet rested on the landing out of which opened Miss Cheel's sitting room and bedroom, and as she stood there the voice suddenly stopped. Was it possible that Agatha Cheel had heard the stuffless sounds which she had made while treading with her bare feet down the wooden stairs? Then, to her mingled fright and relief, she heard the voice begin again, speaking now loudly, now almost in a whisper. Tiptoeing across the lobby, she crouched down outside the closed bedroom door, and there at last she heard quite clearly the words that seemed tumbling out one after another, as if the lips that uttered them could not get them out quickly enough. And yet those words, those sentences, were punctuated with strange pauses. It was as if the speaker were taking part in an eager, sometimes embittered argument with an unseen opponent. I am speaking up. I have nothing to conceal. A tall, dark man. I think I should. It is a broad corridor. No, I did not think of it. I thought him a workman. I did not know I was free to speak sooner. The staccato sentences were uttered with extraordinary energy. Then, with a complete change of voice, came the quiet words, I always liked Mrs. Garlett very much. Yes, she was invariably most kind to me. Of course, Mr. Garlett was also kind and considerate, but I saw very little of him. I was naturally with Mrs. Garlett very much more. Undoubtedly. As long, that is, as Mr. and Mrs. Garlett wished me to stay. £300 is not an exceptional salary. No communication with Mr. Garlett. Once, just after the war. Then, with sudden passion, You have no right to say that. There came an appeal in the voice. My lord, am I compelled to answer that question? They were forced strawberries given by a lady who will, if necessary, confirm what I say. Miss Prince, my lord. And then at last, as if telling a story, and in a much more composed, quiet voice, Agatha Cheel continued. I put the strawberries on one side, partly because I had before me the disagreeable task of giving notice to a servant. I forgot about the strawberries till early afternoon. I then put them on a Chinese dessert dish and took them upstairs myself. I placed them on a chest of drawers outside Mrs. Garlett's room. There came a long pause. Jean's heart was beating, beating. Yes, I will swear they were gone when I saw the man I took to be a workman in the corridor. I thought no more of them till Mrs. Garlett first summoned me in the night. Mrs. Garlett did not say they had been given her by her husband. I will swear to that. I'm quite aware that everything I am now saying is being said on oath. She said, the strawberries upset me. I ought not to have taken them. She had had several visitors that afternoon. I cannot remember who they were. She was very fond of seeing people. went fairly well. In a low, hesitating voice came the words, "Must I go into the details of Mr. Garlett's sojourn in the war hospital, my lord?" Then with a kind of cry, "He always behaved like a gentleman to me." There followed what seemed to the listener a very long silence, and Jean was just turning away to go upstairs when again Agatha Cheel began speaking in an excited, defiant voice. "Certainly not. This is the very first time I have ever seen an anonymous letter. I am looking at it. I entirely deny that. I can't help what any expert says. I don't want to look at it again. I did not know Miss Bower. She was never at the thatched house that I know of." And then there followed complete silence, broken now and then by a moan from the sleeping woman on the other side of the door. The eavesdropper stood up. She walked slowly across the landing and made her way, hardly breathing, up the narrow stairway. What did all that confused, broken talk portend? She tried to piece the sentences together to make sense of them, but the whole formed a hopeless jumble in her weary brain, and when she reached her comfortless bedchamber, she poured a small dose of sleeping draught into a medicine glass and, lying down, soon fell into a troubled sleep. At 6 o'clock her alarm rang out. She jumped out of bed and went over to the bathtub. Oh, how cold the water was, and how cold she felt with this sorry substitute for the comfortable bathroom at Bonny Doon. But a good rub with a rough towel made her feel a good deal warmer. She dressed quickly and went downstairs, feeling her way till she reached the hall. There was a thin line of light under the invalid lodger's door, and as she passed it, Jean heard his stifled, painful cough. Going into the kitchen, she laid and lit the fire. Then, acting on impulse, at 7 she boiled a little water and took Mrs. Lightfoot a cup of nice hot tea. "Well, child, this is very kindly of you, and no mistake. You're the first of my elps has ever done such a thing as bring me a cup of tea afore I got up in the morning. But there, you'll not suffer from being kind. You shall have 2 eggs instead of the 1 I meant you to have for your breakfast. No Chinese eggs for me. Good English new laid, that's all I has any use for. Now you start getting ready the breakfast. Hall have to be early stirrers and early risers in this house. Hall but Miss Cheel, that is. She's not expected to be down at her place till near 11. For the next hour Jean was kept very busy doing the kitchen and helping with the breakfast. At last she took up Mr. Robin's breakfast tray while Mrs. Lightfoot took up Mr. Goodbody's. As for the mysterious gentleman who occupied the back room on the ground floor, he had a specially big breakfast, 1/4 pound of the best butter all to himself. Jean remembered the words, "He's paid for separately, 'cause he's an invalid. You'll have nothing to do with him." And sure enough, in that one case, Mrs. Lightfoot did not ask her to help in any way, save to carry the heavy tray to the top of the kitchen staircase. Then, at last, the two sat down together to their breakfast, and after a few moments, Mrs. Lightfoot suddenly observed, "Did Miss Cheel gabble a bit in her sleep last night?" "Yes," said Jean in a low voice, "she did." "There now, but you'll soon get used to it. The minute she drops off, she's in the witness box, poor soul. That's what's unsettling of her, though she do believe she'll get that villain Garlett off." Jean started so violently that the other noticed it. "What's the matter with you? Got a pain?" "Just a little pain," said Jean, trying to smile. "You'll get used to the stairs after a day or 2. Just pour yourself out another cup of tea and start your 2nd egg. That'll make you feel better." "I don't think I want another egg," said Jean. "Nonsense," said Mrs. Lightfoot severely. "The egg's been cooked, and you've got to eat it. I won't have any waste in this house." "Does Miss Cheel really think she'll get Mr. Garlett off?" "She do, indeed. She thinks she saw the murderer, a strange-looking chap he was, in the house that very afternoon." Mrs. Lightfoot leaned forward. "But it's my belief, Bet, that she's just made that up. If so, they'll soon find it out. She'll never save him, bless you. She don't know as much as I do about murder." Mrs. Lightfoot smiled a broad, cheerful smile. "My poor husband used to say, 'How you can care to read about 'em horrible occurrences passes me, Jemima, but I've made a special study of 'em from childhood.'" "But if she thinks she can prove he's innocent," asked Jean in a trembling voice, "why doesn't she do it now? Why wait for the trial?" "Now you're asking," exclaimed Mrs. Lightfoot, "but I'll answer your question truly. Miss Cheel, She fixed her eyes on Jean's pale face. "Miss Cheel," she repeated, "wants that man Garlett to know she's saved him. Then she thinks he'll give up that girl Bower and maybe marry her." "Marry her?" repeated Jean. "How do you mean?" "Miss Cheel," said Mrs. Lightfoot, "is sweet on that villain herself. That's been plain to me for a long time. If not, why take on so? She saved the man's arm, 'cordin' to her account, when she was a nurse in France, and now she means to save his life. She's a deep one." "Then she says she saw a stranger in the thatched house?" asked Jean. She was beginning to understand much that had seemed oddly mysterious last night. "That's what she's going to say, at any rate. One thing I will tell you, Betchart. She do honestly believe Garlett didn't do it. She said so again to me last night. Funny, wasn't it? She says to me, 'They say they found the place where Mr. Garlett bought the poison. He never did buy any poison.'" "You mean the thing that appeared in the Sunday Critic?" said the girl. "Yes, that's what I do mean. But however did you know it?" "I saw the paper. A friend I stayed with the night before I came here bought it, and showed me the paragraph." Night and day the hidden drama went on, with the vast, dark, melancholy old house as background. From the moment she went up to bed, Jean Bower became intensely herself, that is, the unhappy, agonizingly anxious girl who was engaged to a man whom the whole world regarded as a murderer. And then, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, she would be awakened by the now familiar sounds of Agatha Cheel talking in her sleep, and after a short battle with herself, she would creep down to the floor below and listen to the unseen speaker rehearsing the evidence she meant to give when in the witness box at Harry Garlett's trial for his life. But what to the secret listener was so strange, as well as bitterly disappointing, was that Agatha Cheel's monologue scarcely altered at all from night to night. The suggestions, assertions, indignant denials, and admissions would be repeated again and again in almost exactly the same form of words. Indeed, as night followed night, there came a maddening monotony about Jean Bower's furtive eavesdropping expeditions down to the dark landing. Lying awake after she had again crept into her bed, Jean would ask herself if there was any truth in the suggestion that a stranger had broken his way into the thatched house on that fatal Saturday afternoon, and always she had to agree with shrewd Mrs. Lightfoot that there had been no stranger there. He was an invention, and a poor invention at that, of Agatha Cheel. From 7 each morning, Jean Bower turned into Betchart, help to the poor-natured, talkative, monstrously fat woman of whom the poor girl found herself getting fond, in a sort of way. Now and again the help would hide herself behind the door of the empty front room on the ground floor to see the young lady who was the subject of so much interest and speculation to everyone in the house pass through the gloomy hall. Agatha Cheel was exceptionally well dressed, generally in a well-cut blue serge coat and skirt, a handsome fur tippet, and a smart little toque on her dark hair. She had always been pale, and now her face looked absolutely bloodless. There were deep, dark rings under her eyes, those eyes which were the only beautiful feature of her thin, strong face. Late each morning, Betchart tidied Miss Cheel's sitting room and did her bedroom, and when quite sure that Mrs. Lightfoot would not make an unexpected appearance, she would ashamedly open the drawers in the ramshackle dressing-table and try the lid of the shabby old dispatch box which stood close to Miss Cheel's bed. But the box had a patent lock, and its owner wore the key night and day, according to Mrs. Lightfoot. As to the sitting room, it was bare and comfortless. On the big plain writing table stood a typewriter, and to its right a wad of blotting paper and a box of good notepaper and envelopes to match. A bookcase full of books did something to humanize the room, but Miss Cheel only used the room as a place in which to have her tray meals and when she received her infrequent visitors. And then, just 9 days before what was to be the opening day of Harry Garlett's trial, Jean Bower did obtain conclusive evidence concerning the authorship of the anonymous letters which had first started the investigation. She had finished dusting Miss Cheel's tidy, bare little sitting room when some sudden instinct made her do what she had never done before. She moved, that is, the heavy typewriter which stood on the writing table. Under the board on which it stood lay a thin, fancy paper-covered blotting book. She opened it to find between its leaves some sheets of thin, foreign-looking paper. Shaking with excitement and suspense, she took up the top sheet and held it up between her eyes and the window. Then, still with the sheet of paper in her hand, she rushed up the ladder-like staircase, turned into her large bare garret, opened the attaché case where she kept a few things under lock and key, and took out the facsimile of the first of the anonymous letters which had been given to her by James Kentworthy. Yes, there could be no doubt about it. The watermarks were the same. She sank down on her bed, dizzy with conflicting feelings. Then Lucy Warren had been right in her reluctantly expressed suspicion. It was now certain that Agatha Cheel had written the anonymous letters which had ultimately caused Harry Garlett's arrest on the awful charge of poisoning his wife, and with a feeling of mingled excitement, horror, and triumph, Jean Bower faced what seemed to her the certainty of Agatha Cheel's guilt. As she came back into the kitchen, Mrs. Lightfoot looked up. "Why, child, you do look bad," she exclaimed. "I was going to ask you to go out and get a quarter of a pound of butter, but I declare I'll do it myself. I don't want you laid up." She put her podgy hand on the girl's shoulder, and Jean burst into tears and began to sob bitterly. "I'm all right," she said. At 8 o'clock, Jean summoned up courage to ask leave to go out. She felt she must see Sir Harold Anstey tonight. Considering the importance of what she had to tell him, to show him, he could not object to her going to his private address, a flat in Park Lane. "I want to go out this evening on some urgent business. I hope you won't mind, Mrs. Lightfoot. Would you lend me a latchkey?" Mrs. Lightfoot looked consideringly at the girl. "Well," she grumbled, "I don't suppose I shall say no, though 'tain't by rights you're heaving it out. But there, yes, Bet, you can go." It was 9 o'clock, and Sir Harold Anstey had just finished dinner. He had had an excellent meal and was enjoying a good cigar. But he was in a very bad temper, a rare state for him to be in, but a lady had been going to dine with Sir Harold tonight, and at the very last moment she had chucked him. He felt furious, also, what he was not wont to feel, jealous. The telephone bell rang in the pantry, and Sir Harold leapt up from his chair. "A lady, Sir Harold, on the phone. She asked if you were alone. She wouldn't give her name. She said she'd like to come along and see you for a little while, if you were alone and not too busy." "Say I shall be delighted to see her. And Gun, I'll open the front door myself." Dear little woman. Her excuse that she had had to go and see a sick friend had evidently been a true one. But even to his impatient heart, the sharp electric ring came surprisingly soon. He hurried into his hall, but when he opened the door, instead of the beautiful woman he expected to see, a slight, shabbily dressed girl stood before him. "This is number 8, he said shortly. "You have made a mistake in the floor." "No, I haven't, Sir Harold. I'm Jean Bower. I telephoned and asked if you were alone." "Miss Bower? So it was you who telephoned? Come in, by all means." Though he tried to speak pleasantly, there was a marked lack of cordiality in his voice. "As a matter of fact, I'm very busy this evening," he went on. "But of course, if you have anything important to say, I will see you now for a few minutes, rather than tomorrow morning in my chambers." But as he ushered her into the sitting-room, the lawyer reasserted himself, and the mere man disappeared. "And now, Miss Bower, what can I do for you?" "I found out that Agatha Cheel wrote those anonymous letters. I think you will agree that this piece of paper provides the proof." Sir Harold scrutinized closely the watermark which had been so carefully drawn in on the facsimile of the first anonymous letter. Then he held the thin piece of foreign paper up to the lamp. "Yes, there's no doubt about it," he said decisively. Jean looked at him anxiously. She had felt so absolutely sure that he would be overjoyed at her discovery. Instead of that, there was a grim, almost an angry expression on his broad face. "I fear that I am going to give you a shock, Miss Bower. The whole situation has been changed most seriously to our detriment by the fact that arsenic has been found in a house actually belonging to Mr. Garlett." As she was about to break in, he put up his hand. "Let me have my say out, please, and then I will listen to whatever you may have to say. I have something to tell you concerning this woman, Agatha Cheel. She lately communicated to the prosecution a sworn statement that she saw a stranger in the thatched house on the afternoon of Mrs. Garlett's death. She further says she saw him close to Mrs. Garlett's bedroom door. The prosecution do not believe this story, and neither does our side." "Yet it may be true," exclaimed Jean desperately. The great advocate went on as if he had not heard her.
Now, my theory is this. First, this woman, Agatha Cheel, was undoubtedly in love with Garlett, and she considered herself very much aggrieved when she learned of the man's forthcoming marriage to yourself.
He saw Jean's face change, become discomposed, and speaking a little less harshly, he went on.
Come, you mustn't mind hearing the truth. I take it you would rather know the truth?
She bent her head.
Secondly, to me, and also, I may add, to my brethren of the law on the other side, it soon became practically certain that Miss Cheel had written the anonymous letters, so what you have brought me tonight simply confirms our view. Now, Miss Cheel, to the best of my belief,
he looked at her significantly,
did this out of what I must call, saving your presence, feminine spite. I am quite sure she had no idea that Mrs. Garlett had met with anything but a natural death. What she wished to do was to give Henry Garlett, and no doubt yourself too, a very unpleasant quarter of an hour. If this theory is correct, the result of the exhumation astounded her and caused her to realize that, thanks to her spiteful action, the man to whom she seems to be still devoted is in great peril of his life. This is why she has hit on the absurd, though in such cases common, invention of a mysterious stranger.
He stopped speaking, and in a strangled voice, Jean exclaimed, So what I've brought you tonight is not of the slightest help, Sir Harold?
I don't say that. I'm glad you brought the proof to me and not to the other side, for, of course, anything that tends to discredit Miss Cheel discredits her mysterious stranger. But I should not be a true friend. I should be a cruel friend.
And now his voice did take on a far more kindly quality,
were I to conceal from you, Miss Bower, that Henry Garlett is in the very gravest danger. Till the admission made by Miss Prince—
Jean made a quick movement of surprise.
Yes, Miss Prince has at last brought herself to admit that there was actually a considerable amount of arsenic kept by her carelessly in an open cupboard at the thatched cottage. You are, of course, aware that there was one all-important missing link in the chain of circumstantial evidence connecting Henry Garlett with the death of his wife. That link has now, I regret to say, been supplied.
As he saw the look of agony, of despair on her young face, he hastened on.
I do not mean by all I have said, Miss Bower, that you are to give up hope. On the contrary, if you can persuade the jury that Garlett had not fallen in love with you before his wife's death, you will have gone a very long way to destroy what, of course, the other side are relying on, Garlett's motive for committing this murder, if murder there was.
If murder there was? Repeated Jean uncertainly.
Yes, for I am going most seriously into the question of whether or not Mrs. Garlett committed suicide. A large quantity of white arsenic has been in Miss Prince's possession for many years. At one time, when in better health, Mrs. Garlett was constantly at the thatched cottage. I have found a woman who will tell the court that Mrs. Garlett had an extraordinary horror of vermin, of rats and of mice, and I am going to raise the question as to whether some years ago she did not persuade Miss Prince to give her a small quantity of arsenic to destroy some rats which she believed were infesting a portion of the thatched house. In that case, Mrs. Garlett may well have kept some of the arsenic by her, and in a moment of desperation or of pain administered it to herself. But even Sir Harold's assured voice became less assured as he put forward this unlikely theory. He concluded, after a short pause, The thing for you to do is to keep yourself as fit as possible during the days that are now going to elapse before the trial. Remember that everything may depend on your making a good and, as I believe, an honest impression on the jury.
End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of the Terriford Mystery by Marie Belloc Lowndes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Jean walked the whole way back to Coburg Square. She was numb, spent with misery. For the first time, hope, that elusive yet infinitely comforting and uplifting companion, had left her side, and she felt tonight as if he had never been there. The knowledge that she had failed to secure anything that really mattered by what now seemed to her an absurd and inglorious adventure added to the load of misery and discouragement she was now carrying. She made up her mind to go back to Terriford early tomorrow morning, as the need for make-believe was past. It was nearly 11 o'clock when she reached the deserted square. Quietly, she turned the old-fashioned latchkey in the big box lock. The hall was in darkness, but under the ailing lodger's door ran a thin streak of light. Did the poor man never go to sleep? She felt her way down the kitchen stairs and, turning into the kitchen, lit the gas. She felt extraordinarily wide awake, and yet tired, tired to death. The thought of going up to the cold bedroom where she had spent such excited hours of hope, suspense, and today of triumphant satisfaction filled her with a feeling of sick depression. Suddenly she told herself that she would stay down here in this warm, comfortable kitchen all night. Mrs. Lightfoot would never find it out, and if she did, what matter? She made up the fire quietly. With luck, there would still be a remnant of warmth when she awoke tomorrow morning at 6:30. She knelt down, but she found she could not say the simple, trusting prayers she had said from childhood, for she felt that God had forsaken her. She got up, and by the light of the fire she pushed forward the black horsehair-covered armchair in which Mrs. Lightfoot generally sat of an evening. Then she put her own chair in front of it and lay down. Tap, tap, tap. Jean awoke with a clutch of fear at her heart. Was that the death watch of which her old nurse had once told her? She sat up on her improvised couch, and again there came that strange sound, repeated 3 times. But now, being thoroughly awake, she knew them at once for what they were, a signal, a summons from the invalid lodger who lived in the back room on the ground floor of the house. Jean did not wait to strike a match, but went quickly to the door. She was unwilling to be caught here, downstairs, by Mrs. Lightfoot, so she walked on tiptoe past the housekeeper's bedroom, and then she ran lightly up the kitchen stairs and knocked on the sick lodger's door. "Come in," called out a clear, well-modulated voice. She opened the door on a strange, and to her, a most unexpected sight. The high, well-proportioned 18th-century room was well and even luxuriously furnished. Green damask curtains were drawn across the 2 windows. On the thick felt carpet which covered the floor stood a mahogany chest of drawers, and, facing the door, a high, modern bedstead. By the bed was a table bearing a reading lamp, which, though shaded, lit up the finely shaped head and thin, bony face of the man lying in the bed. His head was covered with a thick thatch of fair hair, and he was propped up on 3 or 4 pillows placed at his back. To Jean's pitying eyes, he appeared to be dying. And as she stood there, still close to the door outside the circle of light cast by the lamp, she gradually took in other, minor details. There was a pile of books on the table, and on the blue silk eiderdown a small volume was open, face downward. "Mrs. Lightfoot," said the invalid in a doubtful tone, "I'm ashamed to have had to rouse you, but I feel much less well tonight, also parched with thirst." Jean took a few steps forward. "I'm Mrs. Lightfoot's help, and as Mrs. Lightfoot is asleep, I thought it better to come up." An amazing change came over the pallid face. It was suddenly animated with keen curiosity and cynical amusement. "Bet chart!" he exclaimed, "and most perfect of Hebes, according to good old Lightfoot. Come hither, fair maid." Jean moved back rather than forward. "What can I do for you?" she said quietly. "If you will tell me what it is you wanted Mrs. Lightfoot for, I will do it." He raised himself painfully on his right elbow and gave her a long, measuring, penetrating look. "Come nearer," he said in an authoritative voice. "You have nothing to be afraid of from the poor dying wretch I am now." She came close up to the bed, and then looking up at her, he said in a very different tone, "Your name is not Bet Chart. You are Miss Jean Bower of Terriford Village." She clasped her hands together. "It's true," she cried, oppressed, bewildered. "But for God's sake, don't give me away to Mrs. Lightfoot." "Of course I won't. And now tell me, how is it that Dr. McLean's niece comes to be here in 106 Coburg Square?" And his sunken eyes were alive with a mocking, mischievous curiosity. Instead of answering his question, she said again, "What can I do for you?" And then, noticing that behind the pile of books was an empty glass, "Do you want something to drink?" "I did, horribly. But now I'm no longer thirsty, or rather, I'm only thirsty for information." It was amazing to see how he had changed in the last few minutes, and yet the long outlines of his body under the eiderdown looked like those of a skeleton. Jean Bower looked round. "The milk and soda water are over there, quite out of my reach. You may have already observed that Mrs. Lightfoot has nothing in common with Florence Nightingale." She turned and saw that on the chest of drawers there stood a siphon and a jug of milk. She went over and brought them both back with her. "Do you remember the scrumptious refreshments at that cricket match, Miss Bower?" She looked down into his pallid, smiling face, and as she met the direct glance of his heavy-lidded gray eyes, there came over Jean a strong feeling that she had seen him before. "Can't you guess who I am?" She shook her head. I have no idea who you are. Mrs. Lightfoot has never mentioned your name."
Then he said in a singular tone, "Why should I make a foolish mystery of it? My name is Guy Cheel. I am Agatha's brother. But she hates illness, and as it makes her wretched to see me in this state, well, we don't often meet. It's my fault I haven't a nurse."
And then all at once his hand shot out, his bony left hand, and took hold of her dress.
"I know why you're here," he exclaimed. "How stupid of me not to guess it. You've come to spy on Agatha. But believe me, Miss Bower, you're on the wrong track. You're not going to help your friend that way."
"I know that now," she whispered.
"There's nothing to find out about Agatha, nothing that will help you, at any rate. I suppose you know that she and Garlett were once great friends?"
"That's not true." She said the words with passionate conviction.
"Not true," he repeated. "Absolutely true. But one thing I'll grant you. Agatha was the one who cared. He didn't care, not even in the war hospital, when he was so lonely. But she thought he did."
As if speaking to himself, he added,
"And I thought so, too. I used to think that if anything happened to his wife, to use the conventional paraphrase for death, sweet, delicate death, he would marry Agatha."
Jean stared down at him. She was torn with conflicting feelings in which repulsion and anger for the moment predominated.
"I'm afraid you are very unhappy," he said suddenly.
She whispered, "Very unhappy." And yet, though what he had said about his sister and Harry Garlett both disturbed and offended her, it was an astonishing relief to find herself with someone with whom she could be herself.
"Bring up that chair," he said in a low voice, "and let us talk it over."
She brought the chair close to the bed.
"Ask yourself, what use was Mrs. Garlett's life, even to herself, and imagine, for the purposes of our argument, that your worthy rector, Mr. Colwright, having in him a secret strain of what some people call madness, but what I should term supernormal sense, told himself that it would be a duty, I will not say a pleasure, but a duty, to send this poor woman to the heaven in which both he and she absolutely believe. Is that an utterly unreasonable supposition?"
"Yes," said Jean in a low voice, "utterly unreasonable." A sensation of mingled excitement, pain, and indignation filled her heart. She felt she was doing wrong in staying with this strange, sinister, cruel-natured man a moment longer than was absolutely necessary. Yet he exercised a certain fascination over her, and again she felt what a real relief it was to be talking to someone with whom she need not pretend.
"Don't be hurt, Miss Jean, at my teasing you, for of course I am teasing you. I quite realize that in our present state of civilization the putting away of a human being is a serious thing, and not to be encouraged. Doctors alone are licensed by public opinion, as well as by decrees passed by themselves, to commit what other people call murder."
She remained silent, and after a long pause, during which his eyes seemed to hold hers in fee, he asked abruptly,
"When is Harry Garlett's trial coming on?"
"In 9 days."
"That's very near," he muttered. "Nearer than I thought. Are you dreading the witness box? My sister is horribly afraid of it. I know that much about her."
She made no answer to that, and he muttered,
"Poor little girl. Poor, pretty little girl. Too bad. Too bad."
And again Jean Bower felt sure they had met, nay, even more, that he had uttered pitying, familiar words to her before. But as to when and where, memory supplied no clue. Guy Cheel lay back on his pillows. He closed his eyes, and Jean felt a pang of sick fear. Ought she to call his sister and Mrs. Lightfoot? Suddenly he opened his eyes.
"Your guardian angel surely brought you here tonight."
"Why?" she asked.
"In order that I might cheer you up by telling you that Harry Garlett is sure to be acquitted, to be given, as it were, the benefit of the doubt."
"What makes you say that?" asked Jean in a trembling tone. She was sobbing now, bitterly. He leaned over with difficulty and took her soft right hand in his bony fingers.
"Not," he exclaimed, "because I believe in British justice. Far from it. But there's just one little fact that will save him."
She looked at him, all her soul now in her eager eyes. "What fact?" she asked.
"The fact," he said deliberately, "that no arsenic has been traced to Garlett's possession. Practically all the resources of the Crown have been used to find where he procured the arsenic, and they have failed."
"They have not failed," said Jean quietly, "in finding where Harry could have procured arsenic. I saw Sir Harold Anstey this evening. He told me that Miss Prince, who is a doctor's daughter and lives close to the thatched house, has now admitted that she kept quite a lot of arsenic in her medicine cupboard. Miss Prince is Harry's tenant." The sick man dropped her hand and stared at her in dismay.
My God, he muttered, that is a bit of rough luck.
I'm going home tomorrow, Jean went on drearily. There's nothing left for me to do here. I'm sorry to be going so abruptly, because Mrs. Lightfoot has been very kind to me.
Yes, she's a good old soul.
He lay back and again shut his eyes. His face had gone very gray. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he opened his eyes wide again.
Do you know Lucy Warren?
He asked in a singular tone, and suddenly Jean remembered the talk there had been concerning poor Lucy and the strange man who lay there dying before her, his body disintegrating, while his mind, his intellect, remained so sound and clear. The color rushed into her face. Yes, I know her quite well.
Lucy's a good girl, he said thoughtfully, and then, I didn't behave well to Lucy, Miss Bower.
I'm afraid you didn't.
Did she tell you so? He asked.
Lucy has never mentioned you to me. I don't believe she's ever spoken of you to anybody.
I want you to do something for me.
There was a touch of urgency in his voice.
It's to take down a message for Lucy at my dictation, and then, in the morning, to telegraph it to her. You will find some money over there in a drawer. I'd write it myself, but I'm too weak.
There came a spot of color into his cheeks.
There's a paper and pencil near where the siphon stood just now. I used to write notes to my sister, but I can no longer manage it.
Jean brought what he asked for, and then he dictated, scarce hesitating for a word.
Miss Lucy Warren, the Thatched Cottage, Terriford, Grendon. This conveys an offer of marriage from one who is your devout lover. I am dying, and I want you. Lose not an hour. Come at once to 106 Coburg Square, London. Guy Cheel. It's a matter of supreme indifference to me that the postmistress of that gossiping little place should know the truth. And the doctor who looks after me here is a good chap. He'll arrange about getting the ring, parson, bell, and book.
As she looked at him, dazed, he said with a slight smile,
Deathbed marriages are not as unusual as you may happen to think them, Miss Bower, and if there were more such marriages, there would be fewer unhappy wives.
She smiled wanly, and in the midst of her own wretchedness, felt glad that Lucy would have her heart's wish.
They were more merciful in the old days, muttered Guy Cheel. In the days of the rack and the stake, any poor wretch in prison for murder could marry his sweetheart. You're sorry that's not the case now, eh, Miss Jean?
Yes, said Jean, looking down at him. I am very sorry that that's not the case now.
Still, there are various forms of prison, you know. I'm in prison here, very much in prison, if I may say so. Oh, how I've got to loathe the look of this room. For all poor Agatha tried to make it comfortable for me. I little thought, when I first arrived here, only 6 weeks ago, Miss Bower, that it would become my marriage room. But in life, now don't forget this, for it's the last thing I shall say to you, in life it's the strange, the unexpected, the astounding thing that as often as not happens.
That's true, she said heavily.
I've got an idea, a good idea, too. I'll be your mediator with the outraged Lightfoot. I'll tell her you had to go away, that it was really urgent, and then I'll break to her that a new help is coming. A good worker, too, much more experienced than poor little Bet Chart is ever likely to be. A tall, dark, magnificent-looking girl, with a will of her own, mind you. So then Lucy will be sure, I won't say of a welcome, but of a greeting.
She leaned down and began to shake up his pillows.
Give Mrs. Lightfoot her cup of tea before you steal away, he said,
and as he caught a look of surprise in her face,
Mrs. Lightfoot is my only friend. If it wasn't that she is such a good, kindly-natured human creature, God knows what I should have done with myself. Well, good-bye, good luck, and thank you for what you're going to do for me. You won't be sorry, Miss Bower, that you've obliged a dying man.
Sorry, she said. No, indeed, Mr. Cheel, I shall always be very glad we've had this talk.
I hope I shall, he said doubtfully,
and helplessly began to cough. She stood quietly by his side till the painful paroxysm was over, and then, "Good-bye," she said, torn between a feeling of intense pity and almost equally intense repulsion.
"Good luck," he exclaimed, "and remember that in this country we are taught to believe that no innocent man is ever wrongly convicted."
A queer, mocking smile came over his face, and then once more he began to cough, and again she waited till the painful sounds ceased. After giving Mrs. Lightfoot a cup of tea, she wrote a note of what she felt to be lame apology, and leaving it on the kitchen table, crept out and went to the nearest post office. The young woman who accepted the strangely worded telegram for transmission looked very hard at Jean Bower.
"This is a practical joke, or what?"
she asked suspiciously. Jean answered soberly, "No, it's not a joke. It's exactly what it pretends to be, an offer of marriage from a dying man."
"Some girls seem to have all the luck. 41 words."
Jean was so tired that she slept away the journey which would otherwise have been so full of disappointed, bitter thoughts, and she felt as if she had been away months instead of days when she came out into the big station yard of Grendon and saw her Uncle Jock's familiar two-seater with him at the wheel waiting for her. He had not come on to the platform to greet her, and for that she was grateful, for she was shrinkingly aware that there were prying eyes and listening ears everywhere, that is, where she was recognized as the heroine of the Terriford Mystery. Dr. McLean said very little while he drove his niece to Bonny Doon. It was not till after she had taken off her things and come downstairs, feeling so strange, so little at home there, that it seemed almost impossible to believe she had been so short a time away, that her aunt suddenly asked,
"I suppose Kentworthy has told you about Miss Prince?"
Jean answered slowly, "I've seen Sir Harold Anstey, and he told me."
"She came and told me, of all people in the world," said the doctor ruefully. "Let me see. It must have been 2 days before you went away. It gave me an awful shock. I could think of nothing else, and yet of course I was bound, professionally, to keep the fact to myself." He hit the table with his hand. "I've always disliked that woman." He turned to his wife. "You can bear me out in that, Jenny, eh?"
"Aye," she said, "and sometimes I did not think you were quite reasonable about it, Jock. But now I see how right you were. Miss Prince must have had enough poison in that medicine cupboard of hers to have killed every man, woman, and child in the place." And then Jean suddenly got up. "I think I would like to go a walk by myself," she said. "I didn't get half walking enough while I was in London." After she had shut the door behind her, husband and wife looked at one another.
"I can't be but glad that she doesn't yet realize that Garlett's as good as hanged already," said the doctor somberly.
"I think she does realize it," said Mrs. McLean pitifully. "You weren't watching her face when we spoke of Miss Prince. Fancy her having got into touch with Sir Harold Anstey."
"That was a bit of a surprise to me," admitted the doctor. "But not all the Ansteys in the world could get off yon man Garlett now."
End of chapter 24. Epilog of the Terriford Mystery by Marie Belloc Lowndes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 1. It is a cold, windy March morning. The trial of Henry Garlett has been fixed for 10 o'clock, but since before 8 o'clock there has been a crowd growing larger and larger every minute round the stately pillared portico of the Grendon Assize Court. The crowd has been compelled to spread out fan fashion, owing to the stout walls which stretch on either side of the building, and women form by far the larger proportion of those who are determined to obtain places in the public galleries and in those seats behind the jury reserved for certain privileged persons. These would-be spectators of Henry Garlett's ordeal and of Jean Bower's agony belong to all classes and are of all ages. Some of the women there have walked 10 miles and more this morning to be present at the trial of the man who a short 6 months ago was the most popular figure in the whole countryside. Motor cars of every make and of every type are drawn up on the edge of the ever-growing crowd. Many of these motors are filled with well-dressed women who have come provided with opera glasses. They have sent their servants to keep places in the queues which are already pressing round each of the 3 big doors. But soon it becomes known that the police will not allow this convenient plan, and to their disgust the ladies have to step out of their comfortable cars and stand cheek by jowl with their humbler fellow women. The great majority of the people who are waiting there on this cold morning have brought some form of food with them, for they mean to keep their places all day, so as not to lose even the smallest thrill connected with what is indifferently called the Garlett case and the Terriford Mystery. It is known that there will be 4 important witnesses: Garlett himself, the famous amateur cricketer, Jean Bower, for whose sake, in the opinion of the vast majority of those who will be present at the trial, he committed a dastardly and cruel murder; Miss Prince, the spinster whose tardily tendered evidence is said to be of vital importance, though no one as yet knows of what that evidence consists; and last, though not least, Agatha Cheel, the mystery woman of the strange story. Most of the men who have come, some of them very long distances on cycles, in motors, in old-fashioned horse-drawn vehicles, and on their own feet, are looking forward to seeing Dr. McLean in the box. Few of those in that ever-growing crowd but have come across the kindly Scots doctor, either as his patients themselves or because of the illness of someone dear to them. But that makes no difference to their eager wish to see him cross-examined, heckled, as it would be called in his own country, by the celebrated Sir Harold Anstey. At 9:30 the doors are thrown open to the public and the struggle for places begins. There are some ugly rushes, with much pushing, kicking, and even pinching and scratching, before the public galleries of the court, which is exceptionally large for a county assize court, are filled to their utmost capacity. The reserved seats are few, and they too are soon almost unpleasantly crowded with a number of pretty, well-dressed women, some with attendant squires to whom they are talking, while they glance with keen, curiosity-laden eyes at the unfamiliar scene. In the well of the court already the solicitors' clerks are busy at wide tables. The long bench, which will soon be occupied by the witnesses, is empty, and so is the railed-in dock, where the prisoner will soon be standing, exactly opposite the high throne-like seat from which the judge, the keen and redoubtable Mr. Justice Freshwater, will direct the proceedings. It is known that this old-fashioned judge does not approve of ladies being present at murder trials, and accordingly the seats to his right and left will be occupied by his men friends and not by their wives. The minutes go by fairly quickly for most of the people there, for almost everybody is talking to his or her neighbor. Also, there is the excitement of watching the various parties connected with the case come slowly in. The first of the witnesses to arrive are Dr. McLean and his niece, and a stir runs through the court as they come in. Every eye is fixed on Dr. McLean's slight companion. Jean Bower is quietly dressed in a black coat and skirt, and a simple little hat with a touch of blue in it. She looks absolutely self-possessed, though very pale. Somehow the sight of her irritates some of the spectators. They had expected a tragic figure, wrapped maybe in long concealing veils. They tell each other disappointedly that she looks a very ordinary young woman. True, she is curiously pale, but then perhaps she is naturally pale. There come in various witnesses of no particular interest, or at least not yet of any particular interest. Then, all at once, there appear, walking side by side, a young and an old lady. Again a stir runs through the court. "That's Miss Prince," someone says in a loud, excited voice. Miss Prince hears the words and draws herself up somewhat haughtily. She is wearing a coat and skirt and a plain, unbecoming round felt hat. The young lady with Miss Prince is dressed more in accordance with the popular idea of a female witness. She is heavily veiled, and looks indeed almost like a mourner at a funeral. The word is passed round that this is no other than Agatha Cheel. She and Miss Prince walk past the other witnesses with averted eyes, and sit at the extreme end of the long bench. 10 o'clock strikes, and now comes the moment when the judge, who embodies the majesty, the terror, the splendor of British justice, walks with slow, rhythmic steps to his place. He is a tall man, and shows off his red robes, deep ermine bands, and full-bottomed wig to great advantage. He sits himself down, gives one long stern glance round the crowded, now silent court, and then he bends his head and busies himself with the notes and other documents laid on the high desk before him. Now the legal lights concerned with the case begin to stream in. Sir Harold Anstey, bustling, smiling, his great frame well set off by his long black silk gown. His wig always looks just a little too small for his huge head, but still there is something very impressive about his strongly marked features and his keen eyes. A great contrast indeed, almost a ludicrous contrast, is Sir Almeric Post, the leading counsel for the Crown. Sir Almeric is a thin man, and his wig looks too big for his head. He has a hatchet-shaped face, narrow, compressed lips, a straight nose, and 2 cold, thoughtful-looking gray eyes. Unlike Sir Harold, who is keenly aware of his audience, Sir Almeric does not even glance round the court, but at once engages in an earnest discussion with one of his juniors. There is a slight stir when the jury stumble into their places. The 12 good men and true are an extraordinarily ordinary-looking collection. Still, every one of them has a confident, self-important look. To some of those present, the reflection that those 12 men are going to decide the awful question of a fellow being's life or shameful death brings with it a sensation of unease. By some mistake, which will be severely noted in tomorrow's press, the newspaper men have not been allowed, till now, to enter the court. They file in and take the places allotted to them. Jean Bower, though she has no reason to love newspapers, tells herself that she wishes they composed the jury rather than the stolid, rather stupid-looking men who are exactly opposite to her. And then, at last, very quietly, so quietly that half the people present do not immediately realize what is happening, the prisoner is brought up from the cells below and walks with firm step into the dock. Harry Garlett is dressed in a blue serge suit and wears a double collar and a black tie. He looks neither to the right nor to the left, but bows slightly to the judge. Amid dead silence, the clerk of assize reads the charge, setting forth that Harry Garlett feloniously and wilfully murdered his wife, Emily Garlett. The prisoner, in a voice which, though the words are not loudly uttered, is heard by everyone present, says firmly, "Not guilty, my lord." The trial is now begun, and even the most frivolous spectators settle down to listen to what will certainly be a terrible and formidable indictment. Sir Amalric Post, however, puts the case for the Crown quite simply and as undramatically as possible. He tells in ordinary, everyday language the story of the painful death of Mrs. Garlett on the 27th of last May. He does not hurry over it. He tells it, indeed, at some length, and then he goes back to the past lives of the two people with whom he is concerned. In a fair and passionless manner, he describes the marriage of the penniless youth, Henry Garlett, to the considerable, not to say great, heiress, Emily Jones, and briefly mentions the fact that there were no children. He gives full credit to Garlett, as he calls him throughout, for his war service, and then very gravely he tells how this still young man came back to find his wife a hopeless, almost bedridden invalid. Lightly, skillfully, he touches on Garlett's great fame as a cricketer, and he even reminds the jury of that memorable match last spring, the first match played by the Australians in the old country. Everyone stiffens into eager attention, and even Sir Amalric's clear, toneless voice changes a little when he utters the words, "And now I come to a new figure in the story of Henry Garlett and of Emily Garlett. I refer to Miss Jean Bower." For the first time he glances down at the paper covered with penciled notes, which he holds in his left hand, and then he gives the precise date of the arrival of the pretty young girl in Terriford village. He explains incidentally that her home with Dr. and Mrs. McLean is only some 10 minutes to a quarter of an hour's walk from the thatched house. There follows an account of how Garlett had given Jean Bower the position of official secretary to the limited company of which he, Garlett, was managing director. And just because Sir Amalric tells his tale in so simple and almost bald a manner, most of those present somehow realize very vividly how much may lie unsaid behind his measured words. He does not propose, he says, to call much evidence as to the relations of these two people, but he will call 3 witnesses who saw them coming home together by the field path from Grendon to Terriford on the day which preceded Mrs. Garlett's death. "Both this man and this woman affirm," he observes in a considering voice, "that they were scarcely acquainted at that time, and yet they were sufficiently acquainted to walk something like 2 miles in each other's company, and Harry Garlett brought Jean Bower through his own garden, which perhaps I ought in fairness to add is something of a short-cut to Bonny Doon, where she was then living with her uncle and aunt." All too quickly for some of the ghouls in the public gallery, and in the reserved seats, Sir Amalric sketches lightly but firmly what happened immediately after the return of the apparently disconsolate widower to the thatched house. "It is admitted by everybody concerned that from then onward Henry Garlett, the managing director of the Etna China Works, and Jean Bower, official secretary of the company, became inseparable. Soon all the factory hands were commenting, though in no disagreeable way, or so I am informed, on their close friendship. I will bring to your notice the fact that Garlett, though besieged with invitations from old friends and acquaintances, scarcely ever went away during those autumn weeks. Now and again he took a Saturday to Monday off, but on the whole he stuck close to his work." Sir Amalric waits a few moments, and a glass of water is handed to him. "And now, gentlemen, we come to a number of significant occurrences. Early in November these two people became betrothed. I cannot tell you the exact date of the engagement, which was kept more or less private by the wish of Dr. McLean and his wife, but it is admitted that by early December this so-called private engagement was known to the whole of Terriford, and, as a matter of fact, the date of the marriage was actually fixed for December 19th. Sir Almeric ends his opening for the prosecution with a strange dramatic suddenness, and calls in quick succession half a dozen witnesses, of whom by far the most important is Dr. Maclean. The worthy physician's ordeal does not last as long as was expected. He is taken through Mrs. Garlett's long illness and describes in very clear language her condition just before the night of her fatal illness. Then he is made to narrate at length the circumstances of Mrs. Garlett's death, how he was fetched by the sick woman's husband, such a thing having never happened before, how Garlett showed a strange unwillingness to go upstairs, and how the witness then, proceeding alone through the sleeping house, suddenly encountered the parlour-maid, Lucy Warren. Finally, how, after a short colloquy with Miss Cheele, he turned his attention to the sick woman and discovered that she was dead. The doctor makes it clear that, to the best of his belief, Mrs. Garlett was already dead when he arrived at the house, and then he explains somewhat haltingly why it was that he then made up his mind that his patient had died from heart failure. In the course of his evidence, Dr. Maclean has naturally mentioned Agatha Cheele several times, and so, at the end of the doctor's cross-examination and re-examination, the judge leans forward and asks Sir Almeric, "Are you going to call Miss Cheele now?" And Sir Almeric says no, he is not going to call Miss Cheele yet. He would prefer to call certain witnesses who will testify as to the relations between the prisoner and Miss Bower, both before and after Mrs. Garlett's death. 5 people then follow one after the other into the box, 3 men and 2 women. The 2 women each declare that they thought it very strange that a pretty young lady should be made secretary of the company, and one of them, a forewoman, identifies a letter she had written to her sister containing the strangely prophetic sentence, "If anything was to happen to the missus, I should never be surprised if Miss B became his second." An overseer at the factory swears that as early as October 1st, he remembers the date because it was his birthday, he told his wife that he hadn't a doubt that, quote, "the boss was sweet on Miss Bower," unquote. But he asserts that he had also expressed surprise because he had never noticed anything of the kind before Mr. Garlett went away. That fact is eagerly taken hold of by Sir Harold Anstey, and there follows a keen cross-examination. The great advocate makes some facetious remarks on love and on love-making generally, and the court for the first time enjoys what perhaps Sir Harold would describe as a little fun. Twitters even come from the witnesses' bench, but Miss Prince looks severe, almost disgusted, and as for Jean Bower, the girl becomes even paler than she was before. The prisoner in the dock looks straight before him while all this goes on. He might have been carved in stone. "Call Miss Agatha Cheele." The words ring through the court, and a thickly veiled figure walks quickly round to the steps leading to the witness box. But as she puts her second foot upon the ladder-like steps, she trips, and would have fallen but for one of the court officials, who seizes her arm and pulls her to her feet again. Miss Cheele is sworn and throws back her veil at the judge's bidding. She, too, is then taken through the story of the death night. To the surprise of many of those present, she speaks in a composed, almost mincing voice. She is asked what happened the afternoon before Mrs. Garlett's sudden death, and in reply she says what has come to be called the strawberry story. That is, she explains how the strawberries were left by Miss Prince, how she put them on a plate outside Mrs. Garlett's door immediately after luncheon, and then how, late in the afternoon, having occasion to go upstairs, she distinctly saw a strange man making his way down the passage. She adds a detail of considerable interest. This is that she noticed that the plateful of strawberries had disappeared. She adds that this fact was noticed by her quite half an hour before Mr. Garlett went up to his wife's room. Sir Harold Anstey, when cross-examining Agatha Cheele, naturally plays up to the story she has told. His object now is to increase, not diminish, the witness's credit. He draws out of her very high opinion of both Mr. and Mrs. Garlett. She tells the court what a devoted couple they were, and how excellent a husband Mr. Garlett was. In fact, she can't speak too well of them. Then Miss Cheele has a few unpleasant moments to live through while she is re-examined by Sir Almeric. He presses her very hard, very ruthlessly, about her mysterious stranger. Does she really believe that the stranger she saw hastening down the passage committed the murder? She answers emphatically that yes, she does believe it. Has she anything that could account for such a monstrous and motiveless crime on an unknown man's part? She replies that there is a type of criminally minded human being who does commit motiveless crimes. Criminal lunatic asylums are full of them. 2. Call Miss Prince. There is a look of tense excitement on almost every face in the crowded courthouse when the tall, angular figure of Miss Prince steps up, composedly, into the witness box. Even the dullest witted of the spectators present is aware by now that her evidence will be crucial, one way or the other, to the prisoner. While she is being sworn, the man in the dock, Henry Garlett, looks at her with a long, steady, rather sad look. The sight of Miss Prince reminds him, with painful vividness, of his wife, of poor Emily. He is the one person in court who does not realize the fearful import of the evidence she is about to tender. For one thing, he is well aware that he has only been to the thatched cottage on one occasion in 2 years, and he does not yet understand how very difficult it is to prove a negative. Sir Almeric Post, for the prosecution, begins his examination of this witness in a conversational tone. It is almost as if he were calling on Miss Prince in her own house and asking her a number of not very important questions, and she also answers in a clear, decided voice, the voice that some of the people of Terriford know only too well. It is the voice of the admonitory Miss Prince, not that of Miss Prince, the eager gossip. Briefly, she admits she is the daughter of the late Dr. William Prince, that she helped her father in his dispensary, and that when there came the breakup of her home and the sale of the practice to Dr. McLean, she thought it within her right to take with her to the thatched cottage what drugs were left in her father's dispensary. And then there comes a sharp quickening of the public interest, and even the judge leans forward. Sir Almeric puts solemnly the question, "And among those drugs I understand that there was a considerable quantity of arsenic in a stoppered glass jar?" "There was," she answers in a clear voice. "Is it also a fact that the jar, marked with the word arsenic printed on a blue label, stood open to view of all those who were in a position to glance up into your medicine cupboard when it was open?" "That is so," said Miss Prince in a lower tone. "And now I want you to cast your mind back to last spring." Miss Prince makes no answer. She simply looks quietly, thoughtfully, at her questioner. "Can you do that?" "I think so, though of course it's difficult for me to swear to anything that may have happened on any special day." "You do, however, remember a late April storm which caused the gutters of your house to overflow, and which did damage to the ceiling of a servant's bedroom on the top floor of your house?" Miss Prince admits that she remembers the circumstance. "Now tell us in your own words what followed." "I wrote to Mr. Garlett, my landlord, and asked him if he would personally come over to my house and see the damage which had been done. We had never had a lawyer's agreement. I was an old friend, almost the oldest friend of Mrs. Garlett, and I was well aware that at any moment the thatched cottage could have been let for a considerably larger sum than the rent I was paying. On the other hand, I felt that Mr. Garlett would not mind my asking him to have the gutters of the house attended to. The expense, considerable to me, would be, I felt, small to him. Also, I should like to say that he was known to me as an exceptionally generous man." There was a stir through the court. The judge leans forward. "Will you kindly keep to the matter in hand, madam?" Miss Prince does not look in the least disturbed by this rebuke. She answers quietly, "Would you prefer, my lord, that Sir Almeric should ask questions and I give answers?" Miss Prince had once stayed in the company of Sir Almeric at a country house many years ago, and she feels quite at ease with him. "No," says the judge sharply. "Go on with your story, but keep to the matter in hand." "Mr. Garlett sent me a note saying that he would try and make time to come and see the damage." Another bustle in court. "Is that note among the exhibits?" There was a hurried looking over of the papers scattered on the table where sit the Crown lawyers, in pleasant amity with the prisoner's solicitor, Mr. Toogood. "Yes, the letter is here." Sir Almeric holds it up before Miss Prince. "Is this the letter?" "Yes, I certify that that is the letter." "As a matter of fact, Miss Prince, you did not actually receive a visit from Mr. Garlett, but you think it almost certain that he came in one day when you happened to be out?" Miss Prince hesitates. "I cannot say that I consider it almost certain," Sir Almeric says quickly. "We have a witness who will swear that you told her you regarded it as practically certain that Mr. Garlett did visit your home to look at the gutters." Miss Prince, for the first time, shows some discomfort. "I may have said that," she answers in a low voice, "but now that I am speaking on oath, I wish to reassert the fact that I am not certain Mr. Garlett ever came to my house. The only certain thing is that he sent in his builder and that the gutters were cleaned out and repaired." "Is it or is it not a fact that your medicine cupboard was often left open, the door of it, that is, unlocked?" Sir Almeric's voice now takes a somewhat unpleasant edge. He had understood that Miss Prince would be a very willing witness against Henry Garlett. "I am sorry to say that is true. The key did not work properly, and as I am constantly taking things out of my medicine cupboard, cough mixture, and so on, for the village folk who come to consult me, I do get into the bad habit of leaving the cupboard door unlocked.
It is also a fact, is it not, Miss Prince, that you are constantly in and out of your house, in other words, in and out of Terriford village?
That is so.
And during the month of April you were constantly in attendance on a dying woman who had been, or so I understand, for many years in your father's service. Now, who looked after the house while you were out?
During some of the time, says Miss Prince hesitatingly, I only had a woman from the village to come in and do for me. Therefore the house was frequently left empty. But when that was the case, one of Mr. Garlett's gardeners was generally about the place.
Still, the house was often empty. Do you always lock your back door and your garden door as well when you leave home, or are they sometimes left open? Be careful, Miss Prince, as to your answer to this question.
Miss Prince hesitates, but only for a moment. She knows only too well what her answer must be. I always locked the back door, that giving access to the kitchen, when I left the house empty, she says in a low voice. The garden door, which only communicates with the garden of the thatched house, was generally left open. There follows a long, pregnant silence, and then there runs a strange convulsive sigh through the court, for the majority of those present realize that by the admission she has just made, Miss Prince has gone far to sign Henry Garlett's death warrant.
That means, goes on Sir Almeric in the same quiet, emotionless tone, that anyone last May could gain access to the thatched cottage, and of course to your medicine room, so long as he or she came through the grounds of the thatched house. It is it not a fact that this entrance to your house, I mean the garden door entrance, is more or less concealed by an evergreen hedge?
That is so, says Miss Prince.
To presume, nothing would have been easier for Mr. Garlett than to go to your back premises, open the garden door, and go upstairs to view the damage done by the rain in the gutters?
It would have been quite easy for him to do so, replies Miss Prince hesitatingly, but to my mind it would have been a very strange thing for a gentleman to do, to come into a lady's house without asking her leave, to go upstairs, and if I may say so, poke about.
A titter runs through the court, and then Sir Almeric observes suavely, A strange thing to do, no doubt, but gentlemen, Miss Prince, have been known to do very strange things if they had certain objects in view.
At that there is again laughter in court.
And now I ask you one last question. As far as you know, was Mr. Garlett aware that there was arsenic in your house?
Miss Prince remains silent for what seems to her audience a very long time. Once or twice the judge glances down at her rather sharply, and then, just as he is about to ask her if she has understood the question put to her, she answers reluctantly, Yes, I think Mr. Garlett was probably aware of that fact. He cut his finger very badly about 2 years ago, and came down to the thatched cottage to ask me to bind it up for him. I took him up to my medicine room, for of course I keep lint and bandages there. I remember, and then Miss Prince stopped short.
You remember, Miss Prince? Says
Sir Almeric encouragingly. Miss Prince turns to the judge. Am I compelled to answer, my lord, what it is that I remember?
Up leaps Sir Harold Anstey, and there follows between the two great barristers a sharp interchange of words. But at last the judge decides in favor of the prosecution, and Miss Prince is instructed that she must state what it was that she remembers. And then for the first time the witness becomes obviously very nervous. In a low voice she very hesitatingly admits, I remember that the door to my medicine cupboard happened that day to be wide open, and that Mr. Garlett and I had a talk about poisons, but I do not remember that we mentioned arsenic. Again there comes that curious stir through the court. That will do, Miss Prince. And indeed everyone feels that Miss Prince has indeed done for Harry Garlett. And then Sir Harold Anstey takes the place left vacant by the Crown Counsel. You told Sir Almeric, Miss Prince, he begins, that though you could cast your mind back to late April, it would be impossible for you to remember what happened on any special day at so great a distance of time. Yet during the last few minutes you have shown yourself possessed of a remarkable memory. You must remember, replies Miss Prince quickly, that when I learned what had been the cause of my friend Mrs. Garlett's death, I realized at once that the only place in Terriford where arsenic could have been procured was in my house. You did not, however, see fit to reveal that very important fact till quite lately. Even then you did not reveal it to the proper authorities. You told it to Dr. Maclean, thus putting him in a very painful position. I deeply regret now that I did not write to the prosecution direct.
But the Garletts had been my nearest neighbors and friends, and I hoped against hope that my arsenic had not been in question. I tried in a quiet way to find out if Mr. Garlett had ever been seen in my house, and I found that, as far as anybody knew, he never had been in my house, with the one exception when he came to see me about his cut finger, for 2 years or more.
I put it to you, Miss Prince, Sir Harold looks at her fixedly, that anyone, by walking from the road into the grounds of the thatched house, could obtain access to your house through the garden door?
That is so, asserts Miss Prince eagerly.
Were any of your friends in the habit of using that door?
Yes, my friend Miss Agatha Cheel, Mrs. Garlett's housekeeper, always came into my house that way. So of course did any servant bringing a message or note from the thatched house to the thatched cottage. But you must remember that there was the back door, used by the tradesmen each morning, also the front door. I should like to repeat my conviction that Mr. Garlett would not naturally have thought of coming into my house by the garden door. The time he came to see me after cutting his finger, he came to the front door.
Sir Harold makes a note of this fact, and it is in a pleasant voice that he asks, As far as you know, and I gather you had many opportunities of knowing, Mr. and Mrs. Garlett were on very good terms the one with the other?
Excellent terms, says Miss Prince emphatically. Deep in her heart she knows that her evidence has gone far to ensure a conviction for murder against Harry Garlett, and now she is anxious to give him the benefit of every doubt that has ever assailed her during the last difficult, anxious weeks. And then Sir Harold makes one of the few mistakes of his brilliant professional life.
You are acquainted, he says, with Miss Jean Bower. I take it, Miss Prince, that you have a very high opinion of that young lady?
There follows a pause, a terrible pause. It is as if all in the crowded courthouse are holding their breath. I know very little of Miss Jean Bower, answers Miss Prince coldly. Alas, that gives Sir Almeric his chance when re-examining Miss Prince, and he draws out of her with infinite skill not only that she does not think well of the unhappy girl who will so soon stand where she is standing, that is, in the witness box, but that on the very day which preceded Mrs. Garlett's sudden and terrible death, she actually saw Jean Bower and Henry Garlett walking home together from the Etna china factory. Miss Prince has proved a most damaging witness. Sir Harold looks grim, preoccupied, and what his enemies call sour. To the surprise of the court, the next witness is Mr. Garlett's builder. He is only a short time in the witness box, and what he says is regarded on the whole as bearing against his employer. While he declares that, as far as he can remember, Mr. Garlett had said nothing to him implying that he had actually seen the gutters, he admits that Mr. Garlett had shown a remarkable knowledge of the nature and extent of the damage. When Sir Harold re-examines, he points out to the man that the letter written by Miss Prince had given the most detailed description of the havoc the rain and storm had caused. Even so, on the whole, the general impression of the court is that the builder unwillingly believes that Mr. Garlett had been to the house and seen the damage. Everyone is tired and just a little cross by now. Whatever happens, people must eat, and it is long past 1 o'clock. The prisoner is taken below. Judge, jury, and lawyers leave the court, and those spectators who are determined not to lose their places take out their little packets of sandwiches. There is a buzz of conversation. Bets are freely offered and taken as to how long the trial will last. Only one man present bets on an acquittal. He is a widower and takes the milk round Terriford village, and though some years younger than Elsie MacTaggart, is supposed to be sweet on her. End of section 25. Epilogue Parts 1 and 2. Epilogue Parts 3 and 4 of The Terriford Mystery by Marie Belloc Lowndes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 3. At last the judge comes up and the officials stream in. Call Jean Bower. What all the people there have been waiting for with almost savage longing is now about to take place, and every eye in court save the prisoners fastened on Jean Bower. The slight girlish figure ascends the steps into the witness box. She is painfully pale, her pallor enhanced by her plain black coat and skirt. Yet, strange to say, Jean Bower does not make a pleasant impression. She is too quiet, too self-possessed. It is difficult to visualize her as the heroine of a criminal love drama. After she has been sworn, Sir Almeric takes her through the story which is now almost tiresomely familiar to most of those present. She sticks firmly to the unlikely tale that till the return of Henry Garlett, 4 months after his wife's death, he and she had been on terms of formal acquaintance, nothing more. And then at last there comes the thrill for which all these men and women who crowd the public galleries to suffocation have been waiting.
I suppose I may assume that after his return this last autumn, you became deeply attached to Mr. Garlett?
There follows a long pause. Twice Jean Bower opens her pale lips, but no answer comes from them. Then slowly she bends her head.
Do you still love him?
The question is asked in a hard, unemotional voice, but it seems to galvanize the witness into eager, passionate, palpitating life. She cries out strongly, almost triumphantly, "With all my heart and soul!" The advocate for the crown turns away. He has scored a great point. The jury have doubtless been moved by that cry of love and faith, but he, Sir Almeric Post, will soon show them, with the pitiless logic for which he is famed, that the very fact of this overwhelming passion discredits the whole of the evidence Jean Bower has just tendered in so lifeless and composed a manner. The entire crux of the case turns on what were the real relations of Henry Garlett and Jean Bower before Mrs. Garlett's death. Were the girl to admit even warm, innocent friendship on her employer's part, she would be helping to prove the case for the crown. And now, who with any knowledge of feminine human nature can doubt that she has lied? Splendide mendax, as the old Latin tag puts it, a splendid lie, but a lie all the same.
Thank you, Miss Bower, that will do, he says suavely.
As Sir Harold Anstey is taking the place of his brother advocate in order to re-examine the unhappy girl who all unwittingly has done his client such a fatal mischief by that cry of devoted love, there is an unwonted stir, even a struggle at one of the doors. Across the now silent court ring out the words, "I must speak now! I must speak now!" The judge leans forward and Sir Harold turns round, a frown on his face. For the moment, public attention is diverted from the slight figure in the witness box. Sir Harold, after a whispered word with the Crown Counsel, observes, "One of the female witnesses has only just arrived, my lord, and she seems to have become hysterical." Again the loud wailing, the unrestrained voice is heard. "I must speak! I must speak now!" Hastily, Sir Almeric takes a hand.
The young woman who desires so urgently to be heard, my lord, was formerly parlour-maid at the thatched house. I doubt, however, if she is in a fit condition to go into the witness box today at all. I understand she has just come from her husband's deathbed.
The judge leans forward.
Do you regard her as an important witness, Sir Almeric? No, my lord. She was moving about the house during the night of Mrs. Garlett's death. Also, she has evidence to tender concerning the secret meetings which took place between Henry Garlett and some unnamed young woman in a wood before Mrs. Garlett's death. Again there rises that strange, unnatural cry, loud, defiant. "I demand to be heard now! I have the right to be heard now!" The judge frowns. He peers forward till he thinks he distinguishes the hysterical young woman who has been making such an unseemly disturbance, and then he says, slowly, distinctly and severely, "You will be heard when I direct you to be heard, and I now direct that your evidence shall be taken after the rest of the witnesses for the prosecution have been examined, cross-examined, and re-examined." During this long altercation, Jean Bower, standing in the witness box, is growing paler and paler. She clutches convulsively the ledge before her, and Sir Harold looks at her with concern. He does not wish her to faint before she has answered his questions. On the other hand, he tells himself that the sight of a fainting young woman always touches your more sentimental jurymen. The great advocate happens to be, however, a far more imaginative man than is Sir Almeric Post, and he realizes that Jean Bower's ordeal has lasted long enough. So, to the disappointment of the court, he does not address many questions to the young woman who has just acknowledged her passionate love for Harry Garlett, and for the sake of whose love the immense majority, almost every human being present at the trial, believe he has committed a singularly foul and dastardly murder. Sir Almeric does not trouble to re-examine the witness. He knows by now that he has practically won his case, and he has no wish to cause any of the hapless human beings connected with this painful story any unnecessary distress. 4. Till comparatively lately, a British prisoner could not give evidence in his own defense.
But that is no longer so, and Henry Garlett is, as is known, eager to go into the witness box. At once, when he is facing the court with a strained, tense look, it becomes clear that Sir Almeric does not intend to play with the wretched man as a cat plays with a mouse. He leaves those methods to Sir Harold Anstey. To the deep disappointment of many of those present, after Harry Garlett has been sworn, only a comparatively short interchange of question and answer takes place between the man now on trial for his life and the man who leads the prosecution against him.
I understand that your only answer to the terrible charge of which you stand accused is that you are absolutely and entirely innocent?
That is my answer, says Harry Garlett in a firm voice.
Well, I would just take you briefly through the principal points. You lived, I understand, for 13 years with this poor lady, whom you married when you were only 22, and she 27, you being a penniless lad, and she a considerable heiress?
That is so, says the prisoner.
Though you claim to have been attached to your wife, you were constantly away from home. In fact, we have it on record that out of the 365 days of 1 year, you were away 144 days.
I think that is very possible.
If necessary, I can prove it.
I accept your statement.
Miss Jean Bower became secretary to the Etna China Company on April 23rd. I understand that you claim to have been scarcely aware of the fact that a charming young woman had entered your employment in the capacity of official secretary to the limited company of which you were managing director?
Of course, I was aware that Miss Jean Bower had become secretary to my company, but as you yourself have just pointed out, I was away a great deal. Until we walked home together the day before my wife's death, I had hardly done more than exchange a few words with Miss Bower.
And yet, during the month before your wife's death, a month which, curiously enough, coincided with the stay of Miss Bower at the Etna China Factory, you were far more often at your China factory than had been the case for some time before.
I deny that, exclaims Henry Garlett, or if it happens to be technically true, it was only because I was just then preparing for the Australian cricket match.
And now, Mr. Garlett, are you prepared to swear that you did not go to the thatched cottage as a result of the note sent you by Miss Prince?
I swear that the only time I was in the thatched cottage for full 2 years was the day I went down to show a cut finger to Miss Prince.
Do you remember the circumstances of your visit to her?
Yes, very well. It was the first time I had ever been in her medicine room, though I had heard of it.
Can you recall any conversation you had with her?
Yes, replies Harry Garlett firmly. I recall our conversation quite clearly. What is more, I do not mind telling you frankly that Miss Prince did mention the fact that she possessed in her medicine cupboard 3 poisons, arsenic, morphia, and opium. There is a stir through the court, and for a moment Sir Almeric is taken aback.
Then you now admit that you were aware of the existence of arsenic in the thatched cottage?
I have never denied it.
Don't quibble, Garlett. Is there anything further you would like to say about this point?
Yes, I would like to say that I remember advising Miss Prince to hand over the 3 drugs in question to Dr. McLean. But I should like to add, though no doubt you will not believe me, the judge intervened sternly.
You have no right to suggest such a thing to counsel for the Crown.
I beg your pardon, I should not have said that.
What is it you wish to add?
Simply that the fact of the conversation that day had actually slipped my memory, till my solicitor, about a fortnight ago, told me of Miss Prince's admission of her possession of arsenic. Sir Almeric moves some of the papers he is holding in one of his hands to the other hand, and then he asks in an almost casual tone,
I suppose I might take it that you were exceedingly surprised when you learned that your wife had died from the administration of an enormous dose of arsenic?
The prisoner stares at him. Then he answers quickly, I was more than surprised. I was astounded. At that, Sir Almeric Post straightens himself.
And yet you asked the jury to believe that while the whole village was ringing with the question as to where the poison administered to Mrs. Garlett could have come from, you had forgotten the all-important fact that there was a large supply of arsenic within a few yards of your front door?
Harry Garlett looks manifestly troubled. For a few moments he loses that air of calm, quiet, rigid self-control. I admit it is very strange, he says at last in a hesitating voice. But you must remember 2 things. First, that I was unaware of the importance attached to the question of how the arsenic had reached my house. Secondly, that I had always known in a vague way that Miss Prince had in her possession many dangerous drugs which, as a rule, can only be procured from a chemist. I mean by that I was not specially surprised at her admission that she had a number of poisons in her medicine cupboard. He has spoken slowly, rather picking his words, and the admission, if admission it can be called, makes a bad impression on the court. The audience in the galleries all feel that they would have certainly remembered such a startling fact as that a large amount of poison was in the possession of a maiden lady living in such a quiet place as Terriford seems to have been. Other questions are put to the prisoner. After all, Sir Almeric Post is expected to work for his bread, and it would never do were he to conduct the examination of a man accused of murder in too rapid or perfunctory a manner. Garlett is shown the letter which was written to him by Jean Bower, and which was the immediate cause of his return home earlier than he was expected. He is taken step by step through the various stages of his growing friendship with her, and pressed again and again as to the degree of his knowledge of her before his wife's death. But when the counsel for the prosecution has done, there is a general impression that the witness has been let off very lightly. It is clear that Sir Almeric regards the prisoner as already under sentence of death. Then comes the turn of Sir Harold Anstey. Sir Harold goes on quite another tack to what he has done up to now. His object is to show what a good, genial, delightful fellow Harry Garlett has always proved himself to be. Though in his heart of hearts he considers cricket to be an idiotic pastime, and though he has on occasion quoted with approval Kipling's famous line about, quote, the flannelled fools at the wicket, unquote, he has made a special study of cricket in the last week, and he now shows that knowledge to the admiration of the court, and especially to the admiration of those present, they are a large number, who make a fetish of the national game. He shows that his client is not only a famous cricketer, but also a remarkably modest cricketer, and not till he has made that fact quite clear does he begin on the real subject in hand. The judge has hardly listened while all this is going on. In fact, he has been leaning back, for the first time, a slight ironic smile on his face. But after all, this is a cause célèbre. Sir Harold Anstey is a popular figure, and must be allowed a fair run for his money. The judge reflects that fortunately for Sir Harold, the money will be forthcoming this time, for unlike the majority of murderers, Harry Garlett is a man of substance. At last, however, Sir Harold gets down to real business. In an almost cooing voice, he asks his client something as to his happy married life. But there he is not quite as successful as he had hoped to be, or Harry Garlett is curiously unwilling to make any play with that side of his past. He answers yes or no to the probing questions, though at one moment he is obviously so painfully moved that some few people begin to believe that perhaps he did really care for his first wife. However, Sir Harold, who is nothing if not tactful when dealing with a difficult witness, now turns to the question of the Etna China Works. He draws from his client an account of all that has been done in the last 10 years, and especially since the war, for the benefit of the workers. He makes it clear what a happy family they all were, and then with light, skillful touches, he brings out how important was Miss Bower's share in promoting harmony and comfort at the factory. He is even successful in making the court realize something of what a very charming, old-fashioned girl she seems to have been. Sir Almeric, who is very tired by now, and who knows that tomorrow he will have to make a long, clear speech to the stolid jury, does not re-examine, and when after 2 hours in the witness box Harry Garlett goes back to the dock, he is mercifully quite unaware that, had there been the slightest doubt in anybody's mind as to his guilt, he might have been kept in that box for 4 or 5 hours. End of Epilog Parts 3 and 4. End of Section 26. Epilog Part V of the Terriford Mystery by Marie Belloc Lowndes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 5. And now opens the second day of the trial of Henry Garlett on the charge of having murdered his wife. The crowds round the doors of the assize court are almost as large as ever, and yet there is not the same feeling of excitement that there was on the first day. For one thing, all the most important witnesses have already been in the box. For another, the trial, though the verdict is regarded as a foregone conclusion, is not expected to conclude till tomorrow. A good many unimportant witnesses have still to be examined, among them a number of well-known men, each of whom, when the issue of the trial appeared far more uncertain than it does now, had expressed themselves willing to tender evidence as to character. These gentlemen will testify, that is, that they have always regarded Henry Garlett as a high-minded man, the best of good fellows, and so on. After all these minor witnesses have been called, examined, cross-examined, and re-examined, then Sir Almeric Post will begin his address to the jurymen. Though it is known that Sir Almeric never cuts a speech short, it is thought he will finish in time to allow Sir Harold to make a start today. Sir Harold's speeches to a jury are a delight to listen to, but there seems some doubt as to whether the famous advocate, who is known not to like interrupting a great oration in the middle, may not so maneuver matters, with the kindly connivance of his brother in the law, Sir Almeric, as to put off the beginning of his speech till tomorrow morning. Yes, tomorrow is likely to be a very exciting day. There will be Sir Harold's pathetic, powerful plea for the murderer, the clear summing up by the judge, who, although an old man, has his wits keenly about him, and then the jury's retirement, maybe for quite a short time, maybe for a long time, one can never tell which, even when the verdict is a foregone conclusion. However, as was said a great many times, perhaps 1,000,000 times by various men and women all over the kingdom that same evening and the next morning, it is the unexpected in life that very often happens, and makes the best-laid plans go wrong. Behold the court assembled, the galleries full to bursting, but the ladies in the reserved seats are not all of them quite so distinguished-looking as those who graced the first day of the trial. On the other hand, 2 noted novelists, one a man, the other a woman, have come down from London to be present at the closing scenes. The judge has just taken his seat, but the prisoner has not yet been brought up from below into the dock, when Sir Harold Anstey rises and asks to be heard. "I have received, my lord, a very important communication," he says, in a tone of such marked gravity that everyone stiffens into attention. And then, was it by some mistake, or in the natural course of events, the prisoner is brought up between 2 warders to take his usual place. He looks tired, dispirited, and for the first time his eyes seem to seek out hungrily, thirstily, the figure of Jean Bower, sitting below him on the witnesses' bench. As if drawn by some magnetic influence, she turns her head round at last, and they exchange a long, piteous look. In answer to Sir Harold, the judge observes in a slow, unimpassioned tone, "I, too, have received what is no doubt a copy of what you term an important communication, Sir Harold. I am exceedingly surprised that the parties in question should have waited till this morning, in fact, till just half an hour ago, to put this communication before me. I have already taken certain steps, and I have no doubt you have done the same, to test, shall we say, the value of this communication. I understand that both the solicitors for the Crown and Mr. Toogood, the prisoner's solicitor, are even now in telephonic communication with London." The judge's words are listened to in absolute silence, and no one can make head or tail of what they mean. But it is plain that both Mr. Justice Freshwater and those 2 great protagonists, Sir Almeric Post and Sir Harold Anstey, are very much disturbed. All kinds of wild rumors are current, but the low murmur of conversation is stilled by the loud voices of the ushers ordering "Silence! Silence in the court!" Every ear is strained to miss not a word as Sir Almeric takes up the ball in this mysterious legal game. He says in a very low voice, "In all the circumstances, my lord, I have arranged with Sir Harold Anstey that he shall call Mrs. Cheel, formerly Lucy Warren, as his witness, not mine. He proposes, with your leave, to put her at once into the box." A feeling of intense relief sweeps through the court. Then everything is going on according to plan. True, those with sharper ears than the others have caught the name of Mrs. Cheel, but most of the eager listeners suppose that it is Miss Agatha Cheel who is going to be re-examined. Into just a few minds there darts a sudden, lightning suspicion. Agatha Cheel had always been something of a dark horse. Has she any revelation to make which she studiously concealed while in the witness box yesterday? Here and there some expert in criminology asked himself or herself whether, after all, Agatha Cheel was not in some way in it, an accomplice, maybe, of Henry Garlett. But curiosity will have to wait. for all at once, and strange to say, without her name being called out in the usual way, a tall young woman is seen almost running up the steps of the witness box. She wears what, to the expert feminine eyes now insistently fastened on her, are obviously cheap, ready-made, badly cut morning clothes, a rusty black serge coat and skirt, and a curious-looking little black bonnet of the kind which some of the older people in court can remember having been worn when they were young. A princess bonnet, it used to be called. This particular princess bonnet has a queer, wispy veil hanging down behind. In fact, the young woman, she is not only a young but a very good-looking woman, so all the men in court notice, looks like a widow of the humblest working class. Instead of being ordered to stand down, in order that Agatha Cheel may be called, to the general surprise, the stranger is sworn. With this witness, the taking of the oath is not a perfunctory formality, as it seemed to be with so many of the witnesses, but a very solemn act, and while she is being sworn, she looks at the judge as if he were the only person in that crowded court. Sir Harold rises to his feet, and then the witness suddenly cries out, "May I speak now?" The judge leans forward. "No, madam, you may not speak now. You are here to answer questions put to you by counsel." She is obviously cowed by those quiet, firm, cold tones, and clasps her hands nervously together on the ledge of the witness box as she stares distrustfully at the tall, stout gentleman who is now going to put to her those questions to which alone she may make answer. "Your name," begins Sir Harold in a very kindly, conversational tone, "is Lucy Cheel?" Most of the general public in court are surprised. What an odd mistake for the great advocate to have made. But of course he is tired and worried, no doubt, by that important communication concerning which he and the judge have just had that curious little mysterious interchange of words. He goes on quickly. "You were Lucy Warren?" Now he has corrected himself. So think all those who have not noted that little word "were." "Yes, sir, and I—" "Stop. Allow me to put my question. It will be far quicker in the end. I mean by that, Mrs. Cheel—" Hullo, Mrs. Cheel! What is happening to Sir Harold? The quick, the bold, the resourceful, the man whose astonishing memory is almost proverbial? Another thing happens which is extraordinarily unusual with him. That is, a piece of paper is handed to him by his junior, and from it he reads the following questions, and in each case without waiting for an answer. "You are the daughter of Mrs. Warren of the Thatched Farm. Your age is now 24. Till 10 days ago you were in the employment of Miss Prince at the Thatched Cottage. Before that you were for a considerable time head parlour-maid at the Thatched House." He reads over these questions, or rather assertions, very rapidly, and each time the woman witness nods her head. "And now I ask you to recall what happened 9 or was it 10 days ago?" 9 or 10 days ago? Sir Harold surely means 9 months ago? Again the witness nods, this time eagerly. "You received the following telegram?" And Sir Harold turns round, and again a piece of paper is handed up to him. The witness holds out her hand. "No, the jury must hear the telegram, so I will read it out." In clear tones, Sir Harold, turning to face the jury, reads out slowly the address. "Miss Lucy Warren, the Thatched Cottage, Terriford." Then he pauses dramatically and goes on. "This conveys an offer of marriage from one who is your devout lover. I am dying, and I want you. Lose not an hour. Come at once to 106 Coburg Square, London. Guy Cheel." Guy Cheel? Who on earth is he? There is great excitement in court, and again the ushers have to command, "Silence!" Here is a rare slice of human nature with a vengeance, though what all this can have to do with Henry Garlett is a complete mystery. Many of the spectators, in their eagerness, rise from their seats in order to get a better view of the young woman who has inspired so strange, so pathetic, so desperate an offer of marriage. 1 or 2 stupid people ask themselves whether, when a witness has married in the interval between the commission of a crime and the trial of the criminal, he or she has to explain how and why the marriage came about. Sir Harold looks at his witness with his kindest, most benignant expression, as he asks in a soft tone, and yet one which is heard throughout all the court, "I take it that you were deeply attached to this man, Guy Cheel, that you and he had some kind of an understanding?" Her head drops. She whispers inaudibly, "Yes, I loved him dearly." The great advocate repeats for the benefit of those who had not heard the whispered words, "You loved him dearly, and so, without even waiting to ask your mistress's permission, you left a note on the kitchen table, went to the village post office, and drew out some money from the savings bank, and went straight off to London?" Again there comes an almost inaudible, "Yes." "And now, Mrs. Cheel, we come to a very important part of your evidence. You realize that you are on oath?" This time she answers quite loud, "I do, sir." "I pass over quickly the fact that within 24 hours of your arrival you were married to this man, Guy Cheel, on what was practically his deathbed. But even before the marriage he made to you a certain communication?" She bends her head. "Now, tell his lordship and the jury in your own words what that communication was." The witness straightens herself, and the judge, leaning forward, looks at her keenly. "I must ask you," he says, but in no unkind tone, "to speak up, madam. Otherwise the jury will not hear you." He might have added, "And I myself am a little hard of hearing." The witness begins in a loud voice. "Mr. Cheel told me that before we were married he had something to tell me about himself." She stops short. Everyone is staring at her. What is all this about? Who is Mr. Cheel? By this time everyone in court realizes that he must be related to Agatha Cheel, as Cheel is such an odd name. Also, a good many people know that Agatha Cheel has a brother. Is it conceivable that he gave his sister away? Can it be that Agatha Cheel committed the murder? Almost alone of all those present, the man in the dock looks uninterested in what is going on. He has become so tired, so utterly weary. But there is one person in court, nobody is looking at her, who is almost fainting with excitement and suspense. That person is Jean Bower. Her head is thrown back. She is gazing up into the troubled face of the woman who is in the box just above her. "He asked me," goes on the witness, her voice gathering strength, "if I would mind marrying a murderer." There is an extraordinary stir, by far the greatest stir that has yet been in that court. I answered him prompt, "No, not if he was the murderer." One or two women giggle hysterically, and there comes a stern "Silence" from the judge himself. "He then went on to tell me that it was he who had poisoned Mrs. Garlett." A strange sound, a kind of strangled half-sigh, half-groan, issues from the man in the dock. He slips down and is seen through the railings of the dock, lying in a heap on the floor. One of the warders, after stooping down, stands up and says stolidly, "The prisoner has fainted, my lord. Shall we take him below?" "Yes, and do not bring him back till I direct you to do so." But this occurrence, which would have made such an impression at any other time, is scarcely noticed. Sir Harold addresses the witness encouragingly. "I understand you to say that Guy Cheel, your late husband, confessed to you before the marriage took place that he had poisoned Mrs. Garlett. Did he tell you what motive inspired him to commit this crime?" For the first time the witness falters. She turns to the judge. "Have I got to answer that, your worship?" The judge hesitates. "No," he says at last, "I do not direct you to answer that question." Sir Harold, now frowning a little, turns again to his witness. "What happened after this conversation with Guy Cheel?" "I got him to let me send for the doctor because I thought he was going to die right then." "But to the best of your belief, this is a very important point, Mrs. Cheel, he was absolutely in his right mind when he made this strange communication to you?" "Yes, absolutely in his right mind, sir. In fact, he wanted me to have in somebody to take down the statement he had just made to me. But I was frightened. I thought he would be taken to prison. Cruel things are done, sir, sometimes to us poor folk, even when we're dying." Sir Harold, in a moved tone, says, "I fear that is so, though I would fain hope not, Mrs. Cheel." He waits a moment. He is so obviously, so genuinely moved that everyone in court feels a sudden wave of liking for him. "Very well," he says, recovering himself. "Now tell me what happened next." "We was married then, sir. He'd fixed it all up before I came." Her face suddenly relaxes. It becomes almost cheerful as she adds, "Of course he'd known all along that nothing he'd done would make any difference to me." Sir Harold goes on in a matter-of-fact tone. "The moment the marriage had been solemnized, he insisted, I understand, on your sending for what I may call an unofficial witness?" Yes, sir. The minute the clergyman and all that was gone, he made me call the landlady of the place where he was living. Mrs. Lightfoot's her name. She had got quite fond of him before I came. She was the marriage witness, leastways one of them. He says to her, 'Mrs. Lightfoot, I've got something to tell you. It's very grave. You've got to remember it. Maybe you'll be sworn and asked about it.' Then he told to her what he had told me."
"You mean he repeated to her the statement that he had poisoned Mrs. Emily Garlett?"
The witness again became almost inaudible, but it was evident that she had answered, "Yes, sir."
"I understand, Mrs. Cheel, that it was not till the day before his death that he succeeded in persuading you to send for a commissioner for oaths?"
She answers in a low, halting voice. "When the doctor told me he couldn't last out the night, I didn't think it mattered what happened. Besides, I knew they couldn't do much till the next day, and I believed that the next day he would be dead, and so he was."
"The commissioner for oaths," Sir Harold looked at one of the papers in his hand, "is Mr. Theophilus Jones."
There runs a nervous laugh through the court.
The judge looks very stern. Sir Harold goes on, "Of 15 London Wall. That gentleman, or so I understand, has influenza. That is why he is not here today."
The witness answers, "Yes, sir, I'm afraid he caught cold coming out to see my husband at night time."
There is another titter, which is quickly suppressed.
"You see, sir, I didn't know what to do. And then Mrs. Lightfoot, she says to me, 'There's a gentleman as is a commissioner for oaths living in this very square. It was him as had to do with the lease of this house.' So I went round to his home, sir, and I just told him the truth, that my dear husband was dying and wanted to make a confession to him. He's an old gentleman, and he was very kind to me. He said it wasn't in order, but that he'd come. And he did, sir. My husband had made me put down, he was too weak to write himself, what he wanted said, and the old gentleman, Mr. Jones, he read it over to him, and then my husband swore it was all true." At this point, Mr. Toogood is seen entering the court, and a memorandum is handed up to the judge. Meanwhile, the witness remains standing quite still in the box, staring before her as if hardly knowing where she is. Sir Harold reads a note from the judge, and then he goes on with his examination of the witness. "Your husband, I understand, died within 5 hours of making this statement?" "That is so, sir."
"That was early yesterday morning?"
"Yes, sir."
"And you started at once, Mrs. Cheel, for Grendon? I understand you did this in obedience to a desire expressed by him?"
"Yes, sir. He made a joke like. He says to me, 'You won't have many opportunities of keeping your marriage vow to obey me, Lucy. But I do give you an opportunity now. The minute the breath's out of my body,' he says, 'you're to go straight off with that paper of which you've got a copy. You're to go to the office of that—' She hesitates. "That rascally lawyer Toogood," he called him. But then, sir, he always said all lawyers were rascals, and he often would have his joke. 'There,' he says, 'you're to find Toogood, and you're to put this before him. No good telegraphing,' he said, 'to judge or counsel. Lawyers are dull, hidebound villains. They'd take no notice of a telegram. They'd think it was a hoax.'" The audience in court turned amused eyes on the gentlemen who are hearing themselves so candidly described. But if they expect to see any signs of self-conscious confusion, they are disappointed. All the lawyers remain perfectly calm, and the witness goes on. "He says to me, 'Have you enough money for a motor, Lucy? That would perhaps be quickest of all. Then, on the other hand,' he says, 'you might be killed in the motor. So best go by train,' he said. So I did what he wished. The moment he was dead, I left him alone with that kind soul, Mrs. Lightfoot, and I only stopped long enough on the way to the station to get the black clothes I am now wearing." And now the judge leans forward. "I regret," he says somewhat severely, "that this statement of yours was not put in yesterday." "I never had no chance, sir, your worship. I did try to be heard." Sir Harold interposes. "May I ask your lordship to allow me to read the sworn statement made by Guy Cheel?" Then Sir Almeric jumps up. He looks ruffled and disturbed as he intimates, "I do not oppose my learned friend's application, my lord." The next thing to do is to release the witness. "That will do, Mrs. Cheel," says Sir Harold in a courteous tone. "We thank you very much for the clear way in which you have given your evidence. I understand that you wish to go back to London as soon as possible. If so, I hope you will use my motor car." A murmur of admiration for Sir Harold's thoughtful kindness runs through the court, but to the judge Sir Harold's public announcement of his kindness seems highly irregular, and his lordship hastens to create a diversion.
Sir Almeric Post, he observes in his frigid tones, in view of what is contained in that sworn statement, it is for you to read it to the jury, and not Sir Harold Anstey.
Very good, my lord, says Sir Almeric, and then in his passionless, clear tones, he reads out the following words. I, Guy Chills, in full possession of all my faculties, though a dying man, wish to put it on record that I administered the arsenic to Mrs. Emily Garlett for reasons best known to myself, and which from my point of view were sufficiently good and conclusive at the time, though I do not expect anyone else in the present state of our peculiar, complex civilization, built as it is on a pyramid of lies, to agree with me. My sister, Agatha Cheel, then lady housekeeper at the thatched house, asked me 3 days before Mrs. Emily Garlett's death to take a note for her to Miss Prince's house, the thatched cottage. She informed me I could get straight into the house through a garden door. I followed her directions and found myself in the empty house. I laid the letter on the hall table. I then bethought myself that I would go upstairs, as I'd heard Miss Prince had a curious collection of medicaments, and I have always been much interested in drugs. I found the room in which they were kept with no difficulty. The cupboard door was open, and I noticed the stoppered bottle of arsenic. I took about an ounce of the white powder and put it in an envelope which I had in my pocket. I then walked back to the thatched farm. There I transferred the arsenic to a large empty pill-box. To the best of my belief, the pill-box, with some of the arsenic still in it, will be found behind the 4th row of books in the small glazed bookcase in the parlor there. I ought here to add that when in the medicine room of Miss Prince's house, I turned up the entry arsenic in a medical work on her table. I thus discovered the right dose for an adult. On the afternoon which preceded Mrs. Garlett's death, I was one of 2 or 3 people who went and sat with her for a time. In a sense, I may say I acted on a sudden impulse, for when I saw the small plateful of strawberries outside her door, with the sugar sifter close to it, I thought it an ideal opportunity for the accomplishment of my purpose. I asked her whether she would care to have the strawberries, and she said yes, that she had not known there were strawberries there. I went out of the room and mixed the arsenic with the sugar, then I brought the plate into her room. After she had eaten the strawberries, I bade her good-bye and removed the plate. She thought outside the door. As a matter of fact, I took it away with me and threw it under a bush in the little wood, where it doubtless still is. I left the house as far as I know without having been seen, though Lucy Warren had admitted me, and we had had a short talk. Lucy was on the point of leaving the house owing to our having been found together, I may add, not in any compromising sense, in the drawing-room the night before, by my sister and Mrs. Garlett. Mrs. Garlett, of course, had not recognized me. My sister, who is a generous woman, handed over to me practically the whole of her legacy, her unexpected legacy of £1,000, which Mrs. Garlett left her in her will. Suddenly there breaks across the level, passionless tones of Sir Almeric's voice a loud groan, and for the second time that day a man faints in court. He is hastily taken below, but not before the Grendon folk present recognize him as Enoch Bent, Lucy Cheel's uncle and Mr. Toogood's highly respected head clerk. Few, however, of those who recognize him ask themselves why Guy Cheel's reference in his statement to Mrs. Garlett's will and the legacy to Guy Cheel's sister should have had such an effect on the worthy Bent. Fortunately for Bent, there is no need for him to be put in the witness box, there to have drawn from him, by the persuasive arts of Sir Harold Anstey, an account, nay, a confession, of certain highly reprehensible and most unprofessional confidences concerning Mrs. Garlett's will, made before that lady's tragic death. That other and greater confession, the confession of Guy Cheel on his deathbed, has shed an amply sufficient light on the Terriford Mystery. After the slight interruption caused by Bent's collapse and removal, Sir Almeric goes on reading Guy Cheel's statement from the exact place where he broke off. With this money I went abroad, and I was still abroad when the exhumation of Mrs. Garlett took place and when Mr. Garlett was committed for trial. While abroad, in Spain as a matter of fact, I became exceedingly ill. I therefore made for home. My sister unwillingly consented to hire a room in the house in which she was then living, namely the house in which I am now. In a sense it has been a race between my life and that of Henry Garlett. I tried to persuade myself that I should in any case have made this confession, even had I not been a dying man.
Had I done so, I should of course have put myself first out of the power of English law, which would not have been difficult, as I have always been a rolling stone, as the silly saying is. I hope it will not be considered egotistic on my part to put on record my high appreciation of my wife's fine nature. She is a thoroughly good woman, and I hope that in time she will forgive me, and that some man, a thousandfold better man than I can claim to be, will make her yet a happy woman. And what is happening meantime in the cold, rather dark cell where so many unhappy prisoners have sat, waiting to be taken upstairs to hear the verdict? By special leave of the judge, Jean Bower has been allowed to go below and join her lover, who will not now be a prisoner for long. Together again at last, Henry Garlett and Jean Bower are sitting on a hard wooden bench, hand in hand. They are not alone. 2 warders are watching them with stolid faces, and they are still feeling bewildered, oppressed by this wonderful thing that has happened to them. Harry Garlett is saying to himself, Guy Cheel? Guy Cheel! Why, Emily liked him. She liked him. The door opens. Mr. Garlett, says a kind voice, the voice of the governor of Grendon Jail. Will you and Miss Bower come upstairs to hear the verdict? They get up. Still hand in hand, they mount the dark stairs. Then the prisoner, he is still a prisoner, raises Jean's hand and kisses it. They emerge into the crowded court, all eyes upon them, and he goes on up into the dock for the last time, while she walks round to the witness bench, where Dr. McLean has preceded her. The jury are all in their places. They have evidently had no difficulty in arriving at their verdict. Then the clerk of the court calls out, How say you, gentlemen, guilty or not guilty? The foreman of the jury, looking very pale, answers in a firm voice, Not guilty. The end. End of the epilogue. End of section 27. End of the Terriford Mystery by Marie Belloc Lowndes.